It's actually tough to buy elections. We saw this in 2024. Actually, 2024.
Wait, what?
Yes. So in my
2024 is your evidence that it's hard to buy elections. The focus of my anger and frustration is on Amazon, is on Bezos, not on the person who orders their groceries in a pinch. Do you know what I mean? And
well, but Amazon exists to serve a consumer base. I go over in the book actually is if you look at who is most likely to consume ride shares, who actually purchases from Amazon most frequently, most consistently, it's actually people like us. And this is ironic in a way because as you said, like free 2-day shipping, how does free 2-day shipping happen? Most people who consume that service, and it's us who we don't know and we don't particularly care.
I don't think that's true. I don't think people don't know and they don't care.
I never made the case in the book that the PMC people are any less moral. I'm just saying that they are the ones who are actually doing the exploitation in a way that other people are just not. As a fact, they just aren't.
You refer to people using Ubers as wanting to have private chauffeurs at a certain point.
Yes.
And you're expecting me not to say to read into that. I'm very pleased to have on Bad Faith Podcast for the first time, Musa al-Gharbi. He is the author of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. He is a sociologist at the School of Communications and Journalism at Stony Brook. Welcome to Bad Faith.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Now, I like to think of myself as the person who put the final nail in wokeness as a political football. In my somewhat viral interview with the author of a book on wokeness, who failed to be able to actually define the term woke when she came on Rising, a morning show that I used to co-host. So I have to start our conversation by asking you how you define woke.
Yeah. So in the book, I actually don't. And I talk about that to explain why I don't in the introduction of the book. But the shorthand version is part of the problem with a lot of the cultural contestation around wokeness is precisely that. It's a term that whose meaning is very contested. People mean a lot of different things when they talk about wokeness. And so what I tried to do in the book, rather than just pick one of those things and then use it is to surface the different ways that people have understood and wrestled with a lot of these terms and concepts. One thing that's really interesting is that across the political spectrum, there do seem to be some points of overlap. They don't cohere into a nice dictionary-style definition, but they can kind of, but they do mark out a sort of social or ideological space that people tend to be talking about when they talk about wokeness. So I'll give one example. The idea of trans-inclusive feminism. So if you're someone who rejects feminism, you're definitely not woke. Everyone understands you to not be woke on the left, on the right. No one would say you're woke. If you're someone who self-identifies as a feminist, but subscribes to a version of feminism that is trans-exclusive, such as J.K. Rowling, you're also someone who, across the political spectrum, everyone would definitely agree that you're not woke. No one says, J.K. Rowling, oh, she's so woke. And so there are these kind of, in the book, in the first chapter, I detail a few of these kinds of things that kind of people across the political spectrum seem to be loosely pointing towards when they talk about wokeness. And one last thing that I'll just note is that this isn't actually the first rodeo, the first time we've had this kind of a culture war. And different terms in the past have marked out this area of contestation that we talk about wokeness today. In the late 80s, early 90s, instead of wokeness, they used the term political correctness and politically correct. What I show in the book is that it used to be the case that people self-identified as politically correct. And by that they meant my moral and political views are correct. Like they literally meant, and to say something was politically incorrect would be like saying problematic, like that's problematic, bro, like that's politically incorrect. And then over time, there came to be this dispute within the left about political correctness, where one faction of the left started associating political correctness with this kind of sanctimonious, purely symbolic kind of approach to politics. And another faction continued to understand politically correct in the way that they had been using it in the past. And then people on the right eventually noticed this dispute within the left about political correctness and started using the term PC or politically correct as a cudgel to attack anything that they didn't like. Basically anything left of center was derided as politically correct, or an example of political correctness gone amok, and so on. And so eventually people stopped self-identifying with the term, and the term became mostly a pejorative or a slur. Almost no one self-identifies as politically correct today. And you see a similar trajectory with the term wokeness in the more recent round of tumult around social justice.
Okay, so you just made this point about wokeness being used as a cudgel, and I think that's correct. That's how Bethany Mandel was using it when we had our conversation and why she wrote her book. But a cudgel for what purpose? And this is what causes me to have so much, sort of dissonance when I talk about woke. There is a gap. There are these internecine fights, as you say, among the left about how we should communicate, what we should call things, what advances our goals the best, how to protect historically marginalized communities that we ostensibly want to protect. But the belief is that we have the shared goal. Many critics of woke don't, in fact, share that goal, but use the fact of the internal dispute as a way to delegitimize the ostensible efforts of everyone who is quote unquote woke, without often offering any alternative prescription for how to address those woes. So the criticism of woke ends up being, in fact, an advancement of a kind of a conservative ideology, an ideology that is fundamentally disinterested in advancing the kind of economic or social interests in historically, economically, and socially disadvantaged groups. What do you make of that criticism of the discourse around criticizing wokeness?
Yeah, so I think, there are kind of two things that people have to bear in their heads at the same time, in my view. The first is, to the extent that there are real problems with the way people have been engaging in various forms of social justice advocacy, it's important to confront those problems and to try to do things differently and better, especially if what we're trying to do is achieve good, positive results for actually existing people in the real world. If something that we're doing is not effective and we really care about achieving results for people who need help, then we should be changing what we're doing. So it's important to keep to be alive and to really reckon with some of the ways in which what we might be doing is not working or is going awry and so on. On the other hand, it is important to it is definitely the case that many of the people who criticize wokeness are less interested in how can we better achieve these social justice goals than trying to delegitimize the goals whole stop. So an example, there's a lot of work showing that what corporations and a lot of other institutions are doing in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, sucks. Like it not only does it not work at achieving its stated goal, it's often counterproductive. As I produced this big literature review, looking at the empirical research on a lot of these initiatives and programs over time that's built up over the last 30 years. And what you can see is a lot of these, not only do these programs not actually diversify workplaces very well, but they often increase tension, increase turnover, increase suspicion and paranoia, decrease cooperation across lines of difference. So they're bad. Like a lot of what they're doing is not just doesn't work, but it's actually bad. But
yeah, you cite some evidence of the idea that people who engage in these, like individuals who articulate or self-identify as woke, self-identify as an ally of various marginalized groups, use that subconsciously to insulate themselves against sort of just being so they'll you raise the example of members of SNCC who got in trouble for using racial epithets or making, uncouth jokes within the organization, who felt more comfortable doing so because they thought, well, look at my bona fides. I spent my whole life fighting for racial justice. Certainly you can't criticize me for, telling whatever off-color racial joke.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the negative consequences of a lot of the DEI signaling is it actually makes people feel more entitled to engage in behaviors and rhetoric that exacerbate the social problems that they supposedly want to fight. And to feel really righteous, though, and to create these states of moral exception from themselves, the kind of blindness where they don't see their own actions and their own loved ones and so on as being a part of the problem. So that's an example of one of the downsides. And so it's but a lot of the people who are critics of DEI, so one of the things that's important to note about a lot of these DEI programming is that the reason some of this stuff came about in the first place was that before the Civil Rights Acts, affirmative action, Title IX, before all of that, workplaces weren't very diverse. And then after these big changes in the law, you started seeing non-white people, women, and then increasingly later, openly gay people graduating college, becoming more overt and confident in their identities, trying to integrate themselves into the professions. And this created a whole bunch of problems. There were like explosive conflicts, lawsuits, high turnover. Like there were very real, practical organizational problems that these institutions were facing in terms of how to have people from divergent backgrounds cooperate together in the service of shared goals, but also competing against each other because you're collaborating with your employers, with your coworkers, but you're often also trying to compete with them for promotion and advancement and so on. And so like making people work together in that kind of a setting under tight deadlines with, standards that you have to meet and all of this, like it's not easy. And a lot of people graduate from high school and all the way through college, and they actually haven't had a lot of experience doing that, and they're not very good at it. So there are real organizational problems now that institutions were facing. The problem is, in order to meet those challenges, they relied really heavily on this like diversity trainings and stuff, which were just kind of, they had never been implemented at a wide scale or empirically tested or anything like that. They just had to do something. And so they reached for this. And over the years, we found out that a lot of what they're doing doesn't work. But you can't beat something with nothing, right? And so like a lot of institutions recognize this stuff doesn't work, but they keep doing it anyway because you can't just not do anything because they have real organizational challenges they're trying to meet. And if you do nothing at all, if you just don't even make an attempt to show that you're trying to mitigate these challenges, you also open yourself up to lawsuits and a lot of other stuff. So unless and until people come up with something better, something that actually works better, a lot of institutions are just going to keep doing this thing that doesn't work, that they know doesn't work, that everyone knows is a waste of time and money and is probably counterproductive. They're going to keep doing it anyway.
So let's talk about this DEI part, because I think that the collective cultural frustration with diversity obligations in the corporate workplace has really fueled, again, on the left and the right, deep frustration with sort of woke politics. And when people on the left are reaching for examples of wokeness's excesses that they can agree with conservatives on, it often comes down to some program that's been promulgated in the corporate workplace. I want to say off the top that I think there's some irony to so much focus being on the corporate workplace when so much of the criticism of wokeness in your book and elsewhere is that there's a disproportionate focus on what the professional managerial class, or what you call the some symbolic capitalists, care about. So the idea being there's this top 15 or 20% as opposed to the top 1% that are in the sort of a cultural intellectual production space, who aren't necessarily as very highly paid. There can be a huge pay gap between them and the 1% that might only be making $70,000 a year, barely above the American average, but they're in the kinds of jobs where they're that has more cultural value, and because there is more kind of intellectual value perceived to be driving their culture product, and that these people, journalists, teachers, lawyers, people in finance, whomever, are what drive our media consumptions are, what drive our media tastes are, who write the stories up. Therefore, we're preoccupied with what the concerns of like a Black lawyer are, as opposed to what the overwhelming majority of Black people are prioritizing. And that has all of these downstream effects. So it is ironic to me that even though we criticize how much focus there is on what the elites of each group care about, that when it comes to criticizing wokeness, we are all consumed with there were people who would throw the baby out with the bathwater because somebody's HR out of the law firm is out of control and very annoying.
Yeah.
I'll just say that. I mean, I'll pause there actually and let you get in there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I guess, yeah. So, I mean, I think one big problem that a kind of mental block that a lot of people have when they think about some of these issues is, one, they kind of misperceive what the status quo ex ante was before a lot of these before a lot of these institutional changes were made. So like the implicit narrative in a lot of these spaces, in a lot of these, is like back in the day, before everyone got concerned with DEI and stuff, people made hiring and promotion decisions based on merit. And now they make it based on identity. The problem with this is that it's just false. So like, let's stick with academia, which is where I'm at. Until somewhat recently, until Adams v. Richardson, so Brown v. Board of Education desegregated, well, officially desegregated K-12 schools, but a lot of colleges and universities continued to be segregated. 19 states had officially segregated college and university systems until 1973, Adams v. Richardson. Before that, in 19 states, there were Black schools, there were white schools. My own father, his whole life, attended segregated schools. And before that, women were, until, passage of Title IX, and then later EEOC rulings against sexual harassment, women had, like, discrimination again on the basis of sex was perfectly normal and common. And even when women were integrated into workplaces, sexual harassment was rampant, and overt misogyny was very common. And then with gay people, in academia, we had multiple lavender scares, purges of people on the basis of their assumed sexuality. And openly queer scholarship wasn't even a thing until the 1990s. So really, and so like before that point, when the only people who were like really even being considered for jobs were straight white men, then sure, if the hiring pool is all straight white men, then no one has to talk about the race, gender, or sexuality of any of the candidates, because what's there to talk about? They're all the same. It's actually only when you stop taking for granted that professors are straight white men that the question of, well, who does get to become a professor and on what basis even becomes a live question. And as a matter of fact, if you look at how hiring and promotion was done prior to these changes, like until the 90s, professors, like departments didn't even have to publicly list jobs and do open searches for jobs. They would just give lifetime appointments. Professors would just give lifetime appointments to their buddies without any kind of competition, meritocratic or otherwise. Peer review wasn't a thing until like pretty recently, actually, in terms of vetting scholarships. It's like, so one thing that's true that people have a hard time keeping in their minds a little bit is that, in fact, if you look at hiring and promotion of faculty and in many other places, it's more competitive than it's ever been, almost to an unhealthy degree, honestly. It's more transparent than it's ever been. It's more metrics focused and standardized than it's ever been. So the kind of rise of meritocracy actually came around it. Like institutions started becoming more formally meritocratic around the same time, actually, that they started becoming more open and diverse. The two things traveled together. It's just false. There was this meritocratic golden era before people started getting obsessed with DEI and identity and so on. The two have been mutually reinforcing in a lot of respects. And so, yeah, and so one of the problems, though, is that it is definitely the case that a lot of what institutions do today in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion is ineffective or counterproductive. But a lot of the folks on the right, especially, or anti-woke folks who level this kind of criticism, don't usually actually have a better idea of what institutions can do instead. They just think we should, just burn these things down. Or to the extent that they have an alternative, it's actually just DEI in reverse. So like under the Trump administration, they've basically used the disparate impact clause, which the Supreme Court recently said we shouldn't be worrying about disparate impact. The Trump administration is saying we absolutely should, looking at whether or not whites and men are being unfairly advantaged. And they're creating new kinds of sensitivity training that they're trying to impose on colleges and universities, and tied to anti-Semitism, tied to all sorts of other things. They're basically doing the exact same. They support hiring preferences for military veterans and all sorts of other groups that they formally affiliate with. They're trying to restrict foreign students from being able to apply to colleges and universities in order to make it easier for people from their preferred constituencies to compete. That's anti-meritocratic, right? And so they're basically doing like a kind of anti-woke DEI is their alternative to. They're taking these same kinds of policies and strategies that actually don't work very well, and just trying to reverse the signs on them. And so this is the challenge.
I think one of the most compelling bits of historical analysis in your book comes toward the beginning, when you talk about the way that increased access to higher education, sort of through the post-war period, starts to change the calculus of how elites are able to distinguish themselves, so that, if more than 2% of the population is getting a college degree, suddenly the mere fact of having the college degree isn't sufficient to distinguish yourself, which is how these sort of cultural arbiters start to increasingly come into become factors. And some of those cultural arbiters are setting yourself apart by showing your solidarity with various movements. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's interesting, if you look at symbolic capitalists, so symbolic capitalists, as you said, they're people who make a living based on what they know, who they know, and how they're known. So they're people who manipulate symbols and data and images and rhetoric. They're people who work in fields, as you said, like consulting, law, finance, HR, education.
Do you consider that to be different than the PMC as described by, Catherine Liu and so many others, the professional managerial class?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so they've also been called the professional managerial class, the creative class, a lot of classy terms. It's kind of a nerdy niche argument of why I don't think they actually cohere as a class in the conventional sense. I mean, for one thing, as you've noted, there's actually a wide heterogeneity within almost all of these professions. You have one group of people who have a lot of autonomy, a lot of pay, a lot of prestige. And then you have this other group of people in the same profession who have a much more precarious employment relationships. They get paid a lot less. They're mostly executing other people's vision. So in academia, this would be like the divide between tenured professors and adjunct professors. And you see the same kind of divide in most of the other professions. And you see a wide heterogeneity in terms of how much money these folks make as well. So they're an elite formation that cuts across class lines. And actually, what I think is interesting is that in some ways, profession, the kind of work you do, is actually more predictive of a lot of stuff today than class per se. So to give an example, what you might expect based on a conventional class analysis is that, say, a tenured professor at Harvard and an adjunct professor at, the University of North Dakota, would have, in virtue of being paid very different and having very different types of social prestige and relation, money and all of this other kind of stuff, that the two of them would have importantly different values, significantly different political preferences, very different lifestyles and tastes, and so on. Instead, they actually seem very similar. In fact, the adjunct professor and the tenured professor at Harvard have a lot more in common on almost all of those dimensions than the adjunct professor has with a nail cutter who works in the local mall. And on the flip side, and so you see this kind of political coalition and a coalition on a lot of other dimensions between both the higher and the lower folks. And then on the flip side, one thing that's interesting is that it's long been the case that the bosses of traditional capitalist industries, so industries that involve the physical goods and services, it's long been the case that the bosses from those industries have been aligned with the Republican Party for tax cuts, deregulation, and so on. But one of the things that's really interesting is that increasingly the workers in those kinds of jobs have also been shifting towards the right. And this is unusual because the bosses and the workers of these non-symbolic industries, they actually do have divergent interests on things like, say, worker pay. The bosses and the workers are not aligned in their interests. And so there's in these and a lot of other respects, actually the work you do seems to matter more than class per se classes. And so for this and other reasons, I don't call them. I try to avoid this kind of class framing. I think that's kind of too coarse. It's kind of a coarse lever for understanding what's going on here.
Okay, that's really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One, because when I hear PMC, I generally think of the class aspect of it as just like classes and it's a group of things, not necessarily like an economic class. But even if we were to get into this reality that there is some degree of class stratification within the PMC, one of the, and I know I interrupted you. I had asked you a question about your kind of historical analysis of sort of how we got this cultural capital of the PMC emerging in the mid part of the last century. But I remember it. I'm going to come back to it, I promise. But I did want to ask you about this because one of my frustrations reading this book that I agree substantially with, and that I've levied many of my own critiques of identity politics and the elite capture of left movements and the way that it's been weaponized against sort of the Bernie-style socialist left and used to decenter class politics. I agree with a lot of it, of what you've written. But there does seem to be a persistent interest in your writing in moving from a 99% to 1% framing to a 20% versus 1% versus everybody else framing, in a way that can sometimes come off as a dogged effort to vilify kind of yuppies, the middle class, people making, between $70,000 and $100,000 a year, $70,000 and $150,000 a year, something like that, as kind of almost like morally failing insofar as they are intentionally or unintentionally exploiting the sincere needs of poor and working class people to advance their own interests, right? So there's a lot of focus on, I think accurately, the way that they co-opt something like Black Lives Matter, or you mentioned toward the end of your book, co-opt the environmental movement to make themselves seem virtuous without actually trying to advance the goals of the underlying movements, while procuring sinecures for themselves and elite universities or getting book deals or whatever off of the back of George Floyd being dead, without actually doing anything to change the circumstances, to reform policing, to get new electeds, to do whatever, to raise the salaries of someone like George Floyd so they were less likely to be in that position in the first place, right? I think that's a fair criticism. But there's a way that in the book, the way we were talking earlier about like, okay, so then what's the alternative? Who's doing social justice the right way is absent, which I think leaves a lane open again for conservatives to say, yes, I told you that liberal elites are annoying and bad. Come over to our side, as though there's any offering there. And obviously you're not arguing that. But there is this hole in the book. And I think the reason that this argument is so easily co-opted by the right is because you don't choose to focus on the fact that as annoying as some yuppie might be with a coexist sign in their yard, or who resist low-income housing being built in their neighborhood, it is ultimately not the yuppies and the journalists that are the decision makers. It is, in fact, the 1%. It is the richest of the rich and the elites and the housing developers and the politicians that they buy. There's a part in the book where you are sort of criticizing people for using Amazon and 2-day delivery and how coercive Amazon is and horrible they are and exploitative they are to their workforce, which is absolutely true. But is the problem individuals who are rush ordering, a swimsuit or whatever, or is it the billionaire at the top who has structured his business so that he can become a trillionaire? Isn't he a trillionaire at this point? Or is that just Elon? Whatever.
Elon,
one of the richest men in the world because of his coercive labor practices that have very little to do with the consumption habits. And isn't the shift from structural problems to individual consumption part of why we haven't been able to make more progress in, let's say, the environmental movement, where there's been so much focus on individual consumption as opposed to like the 10 big polluters that are overwhelmingly responsible for carbon emissions?
Well, I think, so one of the things I actually try to draw people's attention to is the role that symbolic capitalists play in a lot of these structural dynamics. So to take the example of Jeff Bezos. So Amazon faced some blowback before for having these cages for workers, and and they were ostensibly to keep them safe, but they also were these aggressive surveillance tech things that and so the idea of these kind of worker cages was it created a whole bunch of bad PR for Amazon, and then eventually they scrapped it. Okay. But who came up with the worker cage idea? Was this Jeff Bezos who personally came up with the worker cage idea? No, these were white collar professionals who work for Amazon, who are also trying to advance their own careers and maximize their own bottom lines. And the same thing is true for an example that I give in my Substack is there's this guy, Nanjir Herodes, who has a book called Winners Take All, which is about how the millionaires and the billionaires create all these social problems, multinational corporations as well, in their myopic pursuit of maximizing their profits quarter to quarter, thinking really short term, maximalist approach, creates all this social havoc. And then they use philanthropy to paint themselves as the solution to the problems that they themselves created. Okay, it's a good book. But one thing that's interesting is if you unpack this narrative that Jared Herodes tells and look at who actually does things in this account. And when you look at how this process unfolds, who's actually doing the things? One thing that becomes very clear is that the millionaires and the billionaires actually don't do much of anything in the story. Who's writing the press releases that help corporations absolve themselves of blame and deflect blame to other people and give them a whole bunch of credit for these? Who's writing the press releases? So that would be symbolic capitalists. Who is it that's moving all of the money around
right,
to help them?
Why are they writing those press releases? Because they individually decided that they just wanted to cape for Amazon, or because they're employed? To your point, you write about this in the book, right? You write about how maybe I should have let you tell the history, because then this would have come out.
Bregman. Sure, they're trying to. They're trying to maximize their profits because they work, but people do have a choice, in fact, on what to do for a living,
and we can get that.
Where they work.
We can get to that, and I have made it clear that I was a corporate lawyer. I left, and I have some I have many friends who are still in jobs or who work for candidates and things like that I don't believe in and I think are not great. I'll put it that way. But I also want to be clear-eyed about how we live in a world that intentionally makes people graduate from college in debt if they want to achieve any kind of economic security. They're told to go to college, and then if you're not rich, you have to graduate in debt. We have skyrocketing rent costs, food costs, cost of living costs, that we haven't had a minimum wage raise since 2009, and that people feel precarious. And that the system is designed to make you more likely to compromise your values because you feel like you don't have a choice. And many people do have more of a choice than others, but there's no guaranteed health insurance. People are, feel compelled to do things like go into the military and kill random brown people and do all kinds of things they would prefer not to do. And while I do reserve some criticism for the individuals, because as we've talked about in our conversations about Graham Plattner, some people I think, disguise their free will choices as constrained because they're uncomfortable with the reality of what their desires really are. Other people do have, to certain degrees, constrained choices and or are so heavily propagandized into believing that what they're doing is not that bad or it's normalized, that they are full adults before they even really interrogate what they're doing, right? So I just have less heat. I have some heat for that, right? But I have way less heat for them than the people at the very top who are designing the system in a way that makes people feel as though, even if it's not true, feel as though they have no option but to reach for the highest ring and go work at McKinsey and figure out some way to write a press release that justifies Jeff Bezos's coercive labor practices.
Well, I mean, but the thing is like, as symbolic capitalists, we even have a lot more leverage over people like Bezos and so on than we often acknowledge. So like an example that comes to mind a lot, that I think about a lot, is Papa John's Pizza. Papa John got canceled from his own company that bears his name for speech crimes because he talked in a way that people like us didn't like. And he was successfly purged from his company.
What did he say? Remind us what he said.
He went on a rant that I think included the N-word or was talking about Black people. In any case, was talking about Black people in a really negative way in some kind of meeting. But so the idea that you could cancel the CEO of a capitalist industry for speech crimes would seem like the kind of, in our own accounting of the role we play in the world and how strong the CEOs are and how weak we are, it would seem impossible for something like that to happen. But things like that happen all the time. I give another example in my book about the Ford Foundation.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
About the Ford Foundation, which was, of course, created by the Fords for a very specific set of purposes. Symbolic capitalists who worked for the organization decided to just take it a different direction. The millionaires and billionaires who were funding the organization said, don't do that. The people who were running the organization said, actually, we're gonna anyway. And they won. They won. They to the point where where Ford's son, who quit from the organization and said, I hope it goes bankrupt. But even setting aside these kinds of cases where we just overrule the rich and the powerful, they make their decisions largely with us and through us. Almost everything they do is with us and through us and literally couldn't happen without us. Like when Jeff Bezos is deciding what Amazon should do, he's not just deciding on his own. He's consulting with a whole bunch of us. He's reading a lot of the work that we produce. He's bouncing ideas off of, the idea that it's just him in a vacuum making these decisions and that everyone else is just I don't think that's anyway. So one of the things I try to do in the book is to really push hard to try to help because there's a lot of sociological work, especially that like evokes systems and institutions and so on in a very generic way, but that doesn't actually look in a real way at like, well, how do these processes actually unfold? Who does what? How do things actually happen? And when you start unpacking these steps, when you actually look at like who's doing what, at like how things actually happen and who's actually making decisions, it turns out we have a lot more say than we like to
Musa, is your contention that if we had a universal healthcare system where everyone got a universal basic income of $100,000 a year, that people would be signing up to go and defend Eli Lilly and pharmaceutical corporations, pharmaceutical lawsuits against defendants who were hurt by their drugs, that people would be signing up to go and write press releases covering for Amazon being able to force their employees to not have bathroom breaks and pee into bottles in the back of cars? Or are people operating under an incentive structure that is very difficult to break out of because they've intentionally made the world in a way that people feel like they have constrained choices and are able to do so because there's 6 people who have more money than the bottom 50% of the population.
Well, so we all make decisions under constraints. I think that's important to recognize, but I think it's also important to recognize agency. So in another interview I did with the Chronicle of Higher Education, I talked about how one of my frustrations. So before I used to work on a lot of national security foreign policy stuff, and I was always frustrated by accounts by scholars where if you ask them how ISIS came about, for instance, they'll tell you all sorts of stories about how Sykes-Picot divided the Middle East into a whole bunch of arbitrary things and the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's not like anything in those stories is false. But there's no point in the story where anyone from Iraq or Syria picks up a gun, points it at someone else with intent, and pulls the trigger because that's what to achieve any goal of theirs. The people of Iraq and Syria are just motes of dust being blown around by the real actors, the white men, the Americans, the Europeans. And in that way, the structure of that narrative is actually identical to the kind of narrative that the colonialists would tell, where
I hear what you're saying, but I want to be really clear that I fully adopt the critique. I'm more for, obviously Catherine Liu's been on the show a bunch of times, not obviously, there's no reason for you to know that, but the audience knows that. And I fully subscribe to the role that the journalism class, that, all kinds of elites that shape public perception play in shaping public, running cover basically for the interests of elites, the real elites. But I'm also not going to sit here and pretend as though they are not a tool of that power structure, right? As opposed to the drivers of it. And here's why it matters to me. It is true that $70,000 isn't $250,000 if we're talking about the difference between an adjunct professor and a tenured professor, right? It is also true that the gap between $70,000 and $250,000 is nothing compared to the gap between $250,000 and $1 billion, or even $500,000, or even $1 million. And so there does seem to me a disproportionate placement of agency, for one, but also differently than that, there is a characterization of people who make $100,000 as somehow distinct in their interest for financial security from someone making $70,000 or $50,000, as though that amount of money insulates them in the way that the multimillionaires in this equation or the billionaires in this equation are genuinely insulated from precarity. So when you talk about their voting habits being the same between an adjunct professor and a professor, a tenured professor, I'm like, well, that doesn't make, in some respects, that makes total sense because their economic situation and the grand scheme of should we have a social safety net and am I worried about the cost of tuition for my kids to go to college are the same. It is not cheap for someone who makes $200,000 to pay $200,000 a year or overall for their kid to go to college. It's easier than it is for the $50,000 person, but it is by no means affordable. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I see what you're getting at. I would maybe, okay, so maybe another way to try to drive this point home would be to say, like, okay, so if you look at the share of wealth that is controlled by the top 1% of Americans, the top 1% of Americans controls like 27% of America's wealth. Now that's crazy. 1% of people control more than a quarter of America's wealth. Of the richest country on earth, maybe the richest country that's ever existed, you have 1% of people controlling that much wealth. It's insane. Granted, no dispute at all.
I think it's worse than that, by the way, but go ahead.
But notice that the top 1% don't control a majority of America's wealth or anything close to it. And so if you only look at the top 1%, you actually miss the vast majority of wealth in America. Who has it? How is it exercised? In the service of what ends? Now, let's say you zoom out a little bit. You zoom out to the top 20%. Well, then you can account for 72% of America's wealth. Another way of saying that is that 80% of Americans have to make do with less than 28% of America's wealth because the rich and the upper middle class together eat almost all of it and then sprinkle the remnants on the poor and on the rest of society. And if you'll notice there, it's actually the case that percentiles 2 through 19, 2 through 20 actually control more wealth than the top 1% do. They control a larger share, almost twice, not quite twice as much, but significantly more than the top 1% do. And if you just make that wealth invisible, if it just goes unanalyzed, then again, you're actually missing the majority of wealth in America, how it's used in the service of what ends, and so on. It's really important to make
so
that
this wealth
legible.
Just to be clear, the top, I just Googled it, the top, to get into the top 10%, you have to make between $135,000 and $150,000 a year. So the argument, again, if the argument is about the role that this class plays in shifting the agenda away from the needs of the bottom 80%, that's a spot on criticism. If this is a redistributive argument about who controls what and whether that's deserved, I'm curious to get a sense from you if 1%, the top 1% is having billions of dollars that could be reallocated. And again, MMT people, I know that's not why we do taxes. That's not really what this is about. But hypothetically, if we're talking about who has too much when so many have too little, that six people could level up the bottom 80% to where the 90% is in a way that the bottom 10% tier of people who make $100,000 and change could give half their incomes to the bottom 1%, and there's not a bottom 80%. There's not enough of them to bring up the income of everybody else to parity. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I actually see what you're saying, but I actually disagree a little bit. So like let's take Elon Musk has $1 trillion. There's 300 million people in America. If you just took all of Elon Musk's money and gave it to everyone in America, if you just zeroed out his bank account and just distributed it evenly to Americans, they would get what, $300 or something? And so like it's more, you actually can't address a lot of these problems by just,
in fact, that's not the goal. That's why I said MMT. Like the redistribution isn't at the point, but it's to get a sense of the scale of the wealth in a very small number of people versus this middle tranche. And here's but real quick,
I'll just make two quick points on this. The first is that like if you look at the declines in social mobility, the growing calcification of class and so on, as Richard Reeves and others have shown, it's actually hard to explain a lot of those phenomena only by looking at the behaviors of super elites. You actually have to look at the top 20% and opportunity hoarding, creating glass floors for their. So for instance, in order to have social mobility, it has to be the case, in order for people who are lower to go up, it has to be the case that some people who are up also go down. If you just create a situation where no one who is an elite ever experiences any downward mobility, where their children always do the same as them or better, and so on, then eventually it becomes difficult for anyone else to come up too.
I don't subscribe. That's zero-sum politics is what you're describing, as opposed to a politics that expands the pie.
Well, no, I'm not actually trying to describe a zero-sum situation. So the pie can be expanded, but even if you're increasing the space at the top, it's still the case that unless there's a circulation of elites, that there's only that it limits the ability of other people to move up. You need dynamism in the economy. Even when you have growth, you need dynamism. And in fact, a lack of dynamism inhibits growth. And the second problem as it relates to redistribution.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding what you're saying. I mean, I think the argument that is made on the left is that we have an economy that values certain kinds of growth and certain kinds of productivity because it's read through the lens of capitalism. And therefore you have all these sectors where people aren't being put to productive work, childcare, elder care, et cetera, because there's no profit incentive in those sectors. Whereas we have overproduction in other kinds of sectors that are causing all of these negative externalities in terms of the environmental costs, costs on individuals in terms of course of extreme punitive labor practices and all of these other kinds of things. And that if we design the world differently, we could have more people earning better wages, doing more productive work instead of being driven solely by a capitalist profit motive. The system that you're describing, where somebody has to go down if someone else comes up, presumes scarcity.
Well, no, again, like what I'm saying is, so there is like there's not material in terms of material wealth. It's possible to grow the pie. Status, however, is actually zero sum. It's hard for anyone else to get more attention. So, like
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
But more importantly, but even as it relates to the material side of things, one thing that's important to note about symbolic capitalism and our role in society is that I have an essay on this on my Substack where I go into it in a lot more detail for people who are interested. But like one of the big problems that America has had in terms of actually helping the less advantaged in society has been that our system of taxation and redistribution is really heavily focused on this kind of Robin Hood approach of taking to the rich and giving to the poor. The problem is it's actually kind of hard logistically to just take from the rich and give directly to the poor. What ends up happening instead—
when was our tax system, when did we have a Robin Hood tax system?
Compared to almost every other, we have one of the most progressive tax systems in the world, actually.
As compared to who?
As compared to like the whole planet. I walked through it and I have like lots of links and receipts. We actually tax the top and corporations significantly higher than even a lot of the Nordic countries. One of the things that's unique about America is that actually we tax the upper middle class and the middle class a lot less than a lot of other countries. We have this kind of really we demand a lot less in taxation of everyone except for super elites in this country. But one of the problems is that we've had consistently in the United States is that—
so that's not a Robin Hood. If you're saying that we tax the middle class more than Nordic countries,
tax them less,
and not the—
we tax the middle class and the upper middle class a lot less. So we tax
that. I'm sorry, that just doesn't track, Musa, with anything that I've ever learned about Nordic tax rates. They famously pay a larger percentage of their income to taxes, but they don't have to pay healthcare. They don't have to pay childcare. They get all of these benefits.
Yeah, the Nordic countries. So in the Nordic countries, everyone pays a higher, including the middle class and the upper middle class, pay more taxes than they pay in America. And then they have universalized benefits and services. So they don't just give benefits to the poor. They don't just give benefits to people if you meet these specific criteria and these circumstances. So here, the benefits we give are really indexed to people meeting very specific requirements,
correct, they're
eligibility requirements, and the taxation itself. And anyway, one of the things that you see that's really interesting in the United States, that's unique and terrible about the United States compared to almost every other country. So Matt Desmond, my peer sociologist Matt Desmond, he has this book called Poverty by America, where he shows that for every dollar from, whether you're talking about taxes or charity or what have, no matter, for every dollar that's earmarked for the poor, only about 25 cents of it actually gets to the poor. And the rest is eaten up mostly by people like us. So again, so instead of just taking from the rich and giving to the poor directly, what ends up happening is money gets taken from the rich and put into institutions that symbolic capitalists control, and we eat up most of it, and then sprinkle. And you could argue that the poor are better off getting that quarter than if they got zero. But that's just a really inefficient way of solving the social. And the problem in this case is not the super elites. It's that we can take all the money we want from the super elites, but if we keep eating 75 cents out of every dollar—
this is where you lose me. So it is true. For example, there are these examples in California of these positions at NGOs that pay $250,000 a year for someone to like study homelessness, when obviously you could have just given $50,000 to 5 different people, homeless people, and made them not homeless, right? Or paid for their rent for a year or whatever. Okay. So I'm with you on that part, and that there's this whole infrastructure of jobs, of these middle-class jobs. Some of them are in HR, some of them are in these other helping sort of NGO sectors that suck up the money, as you say. But the point of Anand Giridharadas' book is that elites want us to live in a system. The genuine elites, the 1%, wants us to live in a system where they give charitable contributions, and the Ford Foundation and Eli Lilly and whomever fund those kind of charitable institutions so that people look the other way about changing the system in which they have so much money that they're able to sprinkle a little to these institutions to give a few professional managerial class people high-end jobs, instead of having a more Nordic model where they would be taxed significantly more for the broader public benefit that's not means tested. Sorry?
Again, actually, under the corporate tax rates and the rates at the very, very top are actually a little bit lower in some of the Nordic countries. The people who, but in any event, I absolutely agree with you that actually the solution to this problem, this is what I explained in my essay on Substack, is to actually lean more heavily into universalized services for people instead of this kind of weird patchwork qualification thing that gives us a lot of arbitrary discretion over who gets what and under what, and creates all of these loopholes and means for corruption and nepotism and all sorts of other nonsense. I absolutely agree that that's the direction to go, is the Nordic model. But I think, but okay, so actually this is a good time to circle back to that. So because one of the things you asked before that I think is important is, like, in a world where, say, we had something like a UBI, would so many people be doing these kinds of jobs? And my answer to that question is my honest answer to that question is I think the answer would be yes. And the reason is, so as I say in the book, one of the things that's unusual, if you look at symbolic capitalists relative to most of the rest of society, is that we have a lot more pay than most other workers. We have more autonomy, more prestige, more autonomy. Like, there's less people like micromanage, even adjunct professors. You have a lot of discretion over what classes you take. You have a lot of discretion in how you design your syllabi. You can sometimes pick where you teach and all of that. So even the exploited members of symbolic capitalists tend to be, in many respects, better off than peer workers in other kinds of domains. Okay.
Or they perceive themselves to be better off because they have these freedoms, in quotation marks, even if they're making less than someone who's not a PMC,
of course,
who's an electrician earning over $100,000.
Well, and so people often say things like, oh, well, you know what? I could get more money working at Walmart than being an adjunct professor, to which you could ask, okay, well, then why aren't you working at Walmart? And the answer to that question is because they would rather get paid less and have less security, but say that they're a professor at Berkeley, than to make more money and work at Walmart, which would be a kind of social death for them. And so this part is important. So what I argue in the book is that I show in the book that there's this kind of wide gap between what symbolic capitalists say and how they actually structure their lives and behaviors, and that there's a wide gap between how our institutions, whether a lot of our institutions say they're doing and what they actually do and the role they actually play in society. One way that you could understand that gap is to assume that people are being cynical or insincere, that there's this kind of, but what I argue in the book is that's not the case. When people say things, when symbolic capitalists say things like they want people who are poor to be better off, that they want people at the margins of society to live lives of dignity and inclusion, they're not lying. When people were crying after George Floyd was murdered, like, that was a performance, but it wasn't just a performance. They were actually sad. Anyone who watched that, it's, but the problem is we have this sincere set of egalitarian commitments, but that's not our only set of sincere commitments. Most of us are also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think our perspectives should carry more weight than the person checking us out at the grocery store. We think we should have a higher standard of living than the people who deliver packages to us. And we want our children to reproduce their own social position or to do even better than us. That set of commitments is also very sincere. And we also pursue it very aggressively. And these two sets of sincere commitments are in a fundamental tension with each other, because you can't actually be an egalitarian social climber. What would that even mean? And so what I argue in the book is that when these two sets of sincere commitments come into conflict, as they often do, it's this desire to be an elite that often wins out and kind of transforms how we pursue these social justice goals. So we mostly try to pursue them in ways that don't cost anything for us, risk anything for us, require us to change anything about ourselves. And so that's
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. And I think that's really interesting. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No. Well, I was just going to say that the professions themselves, one thing that's interesting about the professions themselves is that this autonomy and pay and prestige we have, the kind of social bargain that was made, and that's explicit in a lot of our professional canons and stuff, is that you should give us this money and pay and prestige, not for our own sake, but because if you give us these things, it will better empower us to help everyone in society, including and especially the least among us. A lot of our professions literally define themselves in terms of altruism and the common good. Like a journalist, I'm supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to be a voice for the voiceless. As an academic, I'm supposed to likewise follow the truth wherever it leads and to speak the truth without regards to anyone else's moral or political interests and so on. And so like a lot of our fields literally define themselves. A lot of our institutions, like Stony Brook University, if you read what does Stony Brook University or what does the School of Communication and Journalism, what are we trying to do? Oh, all of these positive, noble social goals. And so like we literally define ourselves in terms of altruism and the common good. And so the puzzle the book wants to explore in a way is that given how we define ourselves, given how our professions define ourselves, given how we think about ourselves, given our political and moral alignments, we're overwhelmingly on the left, we're overwhelmingly aligned with the Democratic Party, increasingly so. We're the Americans who are most likely to self-identify as anti-racist, feminists, you name it. So given how we understand ourselves, what you might expect is that as people like us gain more power and influence over society, inequalities would be shrinking. Longstanding social problems would be getting fixed. We'd be seeing increased trust in institutions because of all the good work that we're doing. And what I show in the book is that over the last half century, we have, in fact, there's been these radical changes to the global socioeconomic order that did, in fact, increase the position of symbolic capitalists relative to other workers, and that did increase the role we play in society. Everything from policy making to, you name it, we play an increasingly central role. But the consequences have not been what we might have hoped. We've seen growing inequalities.
Okay. Okay. I wish I'm going to really try not to get sidetracked by the last thing you said, which I very much disagree with. Because I don't think that some random adjunct professor is responsible for there not being economic equality over the past 50 years. But I'm going to just put that to the side. I want to come back to this kind of the wages. There's this interesting parallel between the sort of social benefit that you get from being a symbolic capitalist. I want to admit that I am avoiding the use of that term because I think that it is counterproductive to my personal political project. I don't like, in the same way that I want to call all wage earners workers as opposed to consumers, because I want people to identify as workers and laborers who have to sell their labor to have health insurance to keep a roof over their head, as opposed to consumers, the way the capitalists want you to be concerned with the prices at Amazon and your ability to get $2 delivery as opposed to what's happening to the people who are delivering. I also am frustrated by your kind of resistance of the 99% versus 1% dynamic and the framing of wage earners, adjunct professors, as symbolic capitalists, as people who should identify as capitalists as opposed to people who are victims of capitalism or participating in capitalism. I want to say that out loud because I hear myself sort of like passive aggressively wanting to say PMC when you've coined this new term. And I just want to say why it is that I'm resisting it.
I'll just say, like this notion, it's not like this, me framing us this way and looking at the role that we play in society. This actually goes back to Marx. So Marx in Capital, Volume 3, Marx draws a distinction between basically owner capitalists and functioning capitalists. So the owner class, the owners are the people who own things, And then the functioning capitalists are the people who run things, the people who are the
Yeah.
professionals, the managers, the people who make things happen. So this is actually, even going back to Marx, Marx
Yeah. But that
described
doesn't
people
mean
like us as functioning capitalists.
that's fine.
And I think it's important to highlight, to center the role that we actually play in making stuff happen. I don't think Marx was wrong, actually.
I don't disagree with that, but here's my issue. You describe when I cut you off earlier from just going back to the history, you describe this history of there being this kind of swelling of post-war opportunity. Correct me if I'm getting like the dates and the beats of this wrong, but broadly there's the swelling of a kind of mid-century opportunity that then gets constrained for myriad reasons, and a need to give this new class of people something who've gone to college and done what they're supposed to do. They have to be given something when they're not going to be given salaries anymore, when they're not going to be remunerated financially anymore. And that's how you get this cultural capital as a paltry substitute for actual economic comfort and stability.
Well, one of the things I show that I try to argue in the book is that in fact, we actually do have a lot more security and comfort, on average, than the typical worker. And in fact, the gap between us and other workers has generally grown. Now, maybe it's not the way
Yeah,
that
I
we would like
understand.
it. And in
Your
fact, I think one of the big problems um, that we sometimes have, is that when we try to think about our own life circumstances, we actually don't often think about, and we're not even that familiar with, the actual life circumstances of kind of normie workers doing other kinds of jobs. We look to people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and go, we have less than them. But we actually don't pay much attention to.
But wait a minute. This is getting off track. For the fifth time, it's my fault too. I want to stick the landing on this. Can you talk about? Here's my issue. You describe an effort by ostensibly elites to say we need to create value in lieu of there being financial value in having gone to college. Everybody went and got PhDs. Suddenly you went from 0.2% of the population to 5% of the population, whatever it was, getting PhDs. And then suddenly there were no jobs for all these people, and there was nowhere for them to go. So there was this creation of a substitute for the monetary status that they used to think that they were going to procure in exchange for a cultural status. And it seems like there's this real analogy between what has been deemed the wages of whiteness, where politicians and elites realized that they, in lieu of giving economic benefit to working class and poor whites, could say, look, things are going to hell, but at least you're better than these black people over there. I might be closing the swimming pool in your town, but it's okay because these black people aren't going to get to enjoy the swimming pool. It makes people feel like they're getting something when they're getting nothing. And in the same way that I don't like racists, but I'm empathetic to the fact that they're being played like a fiddle by elites who don't just want them to be comfortable, middle-class, happy people, I do find it to be missing the point a little to be coming for these adjunct professors with their $50,000 salaries and conflating them with the people who are really pushing on them the narrative that says you're okay actually because you can, quote Foucault, even if you're making less than your neighbor who works at Walmart.
Well, again, okay, I'll say two things. One is, like, if you look at full-time adjunct professors, actually, so people sometimes, because there are sometimes stories in newspaper articles about adjuncts who are living in their car and stuff like this. But like, actually, if you look at full-time adjunct professors, they actually tend to make more than the median worker. Even adjuncts do.
What's the average adjunct professor salary?
It's on my Substack. Well, I can. In fact, I think it's in the book too. But I don't have it off the top of my head. But it's above the median
The
the
internet
median
says
worker.
about $22,700 per course, translating to an average annual income of about $47,500. It's higher depending on where you live in the country. It's going to be higher in cities.
Well, so they're looking at per course and so on, but the AAUP, actually, the American Association for University Professors, does these large annual statistics where they look at everyone who's working in higher ed, what they actually get paid per year, and so on. And according to and their stats show very clearly that full-time adjunct professors make more than the median worker in the United States.
Right, but how many adjunct professors are full time? Like you can judge the numbers the way you want to
Well,
judge the numbers.
a lot of them, and even the folks who are not full time, often.
Wait, so are we really debating over you want to die on the hill of adjunct professors make a lot of money actually when the average American salary is $60,000 and the average adjunct salary according to the internet, I don't know, is $47,500. Let's say it is $60,000, but it's an average salary.
Well, the hill I want to die on is that it's inappropriate and in fact not really respectful of people who are actually suffering through dire circumstances that are not in their control when they can't get paid more doing a different type of work, to have people who are choosing who could actually get a higher paid job, even in their own self-description, who could actually be getting a higher paid job doing something else, but refuse to do that because it's below them, to then describe themselves as poor. I don't think that's the hill that I want to push back against here.
I don't know that certainly that is in some ways the case, but I'm trying to get to I want to live in a world where everyone can pursue what their interests are. Not a world where I castigate people who are trying to pursue their interests and not do a less, let's say intellectually stimulating or to do a more physically laborious job. I don't want anybody to have to be peeing in a water bottle on their feet all day in an Amazon factory.
Well, sure.
So my interest is not in chastising people who also don't want to be peeing in bottles and working on their feet and being driven so hard in an Amazon factory just because they technically might be able to make more money doing it, or standing on their feet in Walmart all day just because because there are real world advantages.
But there's plenty of other normie jobs that they can do. Again, like one of the reasons why people stay in these kinds of positions is because one, as you said, they're pursuing their genuine interests and they have the luxury of doing so. And then two, because they like the status of being a professor more than they would like the status of being a manager at Cheesecake Factory. And so they're chasing status.
Yeah, and the wages of that status, this is what I'm so interested in. You describe, for some reason you won't give this accounting. It was so interesting in the book. I would love for you to just describe what you said in the book, because obviously you know it better than I do. But you describe this process of how this new class even emerged, precisely because there was a widening of opportunity to get more education that had previously been limited to only the very, very rich. And so then when that happens, the very, very rich have to redefine their value vis-a-vis all these poorer or middle class people who now have access to higher education, right?
Well, the story I try to tell in the book is that so one of the things I detail in towards the end of the first chapter and then going into the second chapter, when you look at the kind of creation of these knowledge professions, is that as capitalism kind of took off and industries became more complex and organizations became larger, there were these real needs that a lot of organizations had to kind of manage this complexity and actually make these organizations work at the scale and with the level of complexity that they. And so this is part of the reason why these jobs were started to expand during that early period. And then what happened over time is that, as you said, a lot of people who are interested in this kind of growing set of opportunities in these symbolic professions started enrolling more and more in colleges and university and doing other kinds of training to try to equip them to be competitive for these positions. But then there was a problem where there's a problem that sociologists describe as elite overproduction. Elite overproduction is when society is producing more people that have a reasonable expectation of being elites than we have the capacity to actually give them the lives they feel entitled to and what they were taking for granted. And so you have growing numbers of people who did everything right. They went to school, they majored in the right things, they got good grades, and they were just taking for granted that they would have a high six-figure salary and be able to easily buy a house and that they'd be able to get married and have kids by a certain age. And then it turns out that this set of lifestyles and expectations that they had just taken for granted their whole lives, it either doesn't seem to be in the cards for them, or if they're going to be able to realize it at all, it's going to be a lot more of a slog, a lot more competitive, a lot more precarious than they thought it was going to be. When you find growing numbers of elite aspirants who find themselves in that position, what they often do is indict the social order that they think failed them and try to tear down some of the existing elites to make room for themselves, and to try to tear down some of their competitors in order to make room for themselves. And I argue that these moments of heightened competition among elites for a relatively small number of positions during these periods of contraction and when elite overproduction, that a lot of when people are talking about these periods of awakening and wokeness and so on, actually what they're missing about what's actually happening during these moments of tension and conflict is this economic story of these elite aspirants and their struggles and their precarity in this moment. So one of the things I show in the book is that, a lot of people had been talking about that something seemed to have changed after 2010 in the culture. A lot of this discussion was like really heavily reliant on like vibes and anecdotes. So there would be something that happened at Middlebury University, and then you'd see 2,000 New York Times columns about kids these days and Twitter and it's the end of Western civilization and so on. And I'm a sociologist, so I was like, well, hey, if something actually is changing in the culture, it should be something that we could, I don't know, measure. And so my colleagues and I, we set out to try to see, well, did something change? And if so, what? And what we found, we analyzed like tens of millions of news articles. We looked at changes in protest activity, changes in political alignment, changes in how people self-identify, all sorts of things. And what we found is that something did change after 2010. It wasn't. It was a change that actually was most pronounced, actually almost purely confined to communities and institutions and professionals who were tied to the symbolic industries. So you didn't see radical changes in how truck drivers drive their trucks. Nail cutters weren't cutting nails in a woke way. You didn't see radical changes in political alignments and views for a lot of other types of people. It was a very
nail cutter.
I forget what the specific,
like a manicurist.
People who do manicures, pedicures.
Oh, okay.
There's a term, but I don't know what.
Sorry, I'm like, is this like a key, like a key copier in the mall? Like, what is that?
No, I just
carpentry term I don't know about. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So you see that there was changes. There are a very specific subset of people that changed the most.
Sure.
And one thing that we also noticed that was really important is that this period of heightened contestation and change that we saw after 2010 was actually a case of something, using these same kind of measures to see that something changed after 2010 and seemed to have peaked around 2021. We can see that there were 3 previous episodes of awakening or tensions over social justice, these heightened conflicts over social justice within the symbolic professions. There are 3 previous episodes in the 20th century. There was one in the 20s through the early 30s. There was one in the mid 60s to the early 70s. There was one in the late 80s to early 90s. And if we understand this as a repeating phenomenon, as a case of something, then we can look at, why do these things happen Why don't they go on forever? Do they actually change anything? And so on. We can compare and contrast these episodes. And when I did that, I saw that there were basically two factors that seemed to predict when we would have these periods of heightened unrest and culture wars over social justice and so on. The first predictor, as I said, was this period was when elite overproduction grew especially acute, when you have more and more elite aspirants who can't be absorbed into the social structure in the way that they had taken for granted and hoped. The second, but elite overproduction itself can't predict these episodes in part because there's often this counter-cyclical relationship between the fortunes of elites and non-elites, which is to say, times that are really good for elites are often times that are pretty tough for other workers, because if elites have a lot more coercive power, they're in a stronger position to dictate the terms of goods and services. That's often bad for workers. And then on the flip side, when times are pretty good for workers, when they have a stronger market position, they can dominate, they can dictate more the terms of their labor, that those tend to be relatively lean times for elites. So there's this counter-cyclical nature.
And who are we talking by elites? We're meaning that we're including people who make $100,000 a year?
Sure. I mean, for the purpose, so if you're someone like, so one of the things that's really interesting about symbolic capitalists is that we actually do consume a lot more services than a lot of other people. Like we want to go boop, boop, boop and have disposable chauffeurs that take us everywhere rather than taking public transportation. We have people watching our kids.
That was a wild part of the book, Musa, because you rightly skewered the defeat of the California bill that would have made Uber treat drivers as employees that would have benefits as opposed to contract workers. You rightly say that is bad, and you rightly describe how Uber mistreats their employees. But then you describe it as California is this blue state, a liberal bastion, and yet Californians voted for these coercive labor practices as though billionaires didn't spend untold, ungodly amounts of money to lobby to make sure that thing failed.
Well, sure, but one of the things that you see actually is that it's actually tough to buy elections. We saw this in 2024. Actually, 2024.
Wait, what?
Yes. So in my
2024 is your evidence that it's hard to buy elections when Marianne Adelson funded literally half of Donald Trump's budget, and now we are in 2.5 years, almost 3 years into a genocide in Gaza funded by the American taxpayer.
Well, okay, so two things. So first, the genocide was I mean, the Biden administration enabled this as well but that's kind of a
say that to me.
Yeah, that's the side note.
It's your contention.
But yeah, so when you look at the donor base in the 2024 election, two things are true. One, actually, Donald Trump was actually a little bit less reliant on elite donors than he had a higher share of grassroots donations than Kamala Harris.
Right, but that's
the Democrats also.
Both of them do it, but both of them do it is not an argument for billionaires don't buy elections. It is an argument for billionaires buy elections on both sides.
No, because Democrats outspent Republicans 2-1. They had many more billionaires and they lost.
Absolutely. But that is my argument. Billionaires buy elections. Billionaires buy elections.
But this is the case where the side that had the more billionaires and more billionaire money lost the election. They did not get their way.
You're missing the point, Musa, is that billionaires give to both sides so that no matter who wins, they win. We have we live in a oligarchy. It is completely captured on both sides of the aisle. You'll have the same person and or institution even giving to both sides. Sam Bankman-Fried famously had his partner in the FX business, who was a conservative, who was basically matching his donations to conservative candidates while Sam Bankman-Fried was giving them the Democratic candidates. It doesn't mean anything. So I take your point fully. I'm not defending Democrats here by any means.
Well, another part of the problem with this narrative, though, of course, is that it just assumes that people are easily propagandized and that the billionaires spend this money.
They're not easily propagandized. It takes billions of dollars to propagandize them. Jeffrey Bezos bought a newspaper to propagandize them.
Well, actually, what we can see in the social science research, so two social scientists, Brookman and Kalla, did this huge meta-analysis looking at what's the actual effect at all of this campaign spending in terms of shifting votes, and they found that the effect is basically zero. And on top of that, there is a lot of research. There's a great book by Hugo Mercier. It's called Not Born Yesterday, that summarizes a lot of the social science research on this, that it's actually really tough. People are actually not super manipulable. They're actually pretty resistant to propaganda. They recognize when people are trying to manipulate them. They don't just shift their minds willy-nilly because of something that they saw on Facebook or whatever. That's just not actually the case. So it actually is very hard to buy elections. That's just a fact. Now, the fact that now it's actually a lot easier to buy politicians. So among the people who get into office, among the people who do get into office, getting those people to do what elites want through lobbying money and all of that is one thing. But in terms of shifting the voters, it's actually pretty tough to shift to spend money to shift voters. If that's what you mean. That's a
potato thing, Musa. Like, so first of all, Uber spent an unprecedented amount of lobbying for the Uber case that we were talking about before. An unprecedented, like, it broke records. And more importantly, to your point about them buying politicians, 100%. If you don't have the option, this is part of why I'm so frustrated with the duopoly. If you're only presented a handful of options, all of whom support Israel in Zionism, all of whom object to a billionaire tax, all of whom don't support Medicare for all, then all you have is the mere illusion of choice. And so, yes, you have constructively bought the election by clearing the field of anybody who actually reflects the interest of the population. And so, yeah, so this is why I'm going back and forth here with you. And as I'm reading the book, it's like, yes, journalists helped to defeat a populist left uprising and Bernie Sanders. We saw in the Podesta leaks how they had weaponized all of these journalists to basically do hit pieces on Bernie Sanders and the like, and to run cover for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and then again. And
I'll add, Hillary Clinton actually leaned a lot into what is often derisively called wokeness in order to try to delegitimize Bernie 100%. Sanders. Like, I can't.
100%. That's how my career started, is writing about exactly
that's burned into my brain, of course, that's going to be very familiar to you, is this moment when Hillary was like, "Oh, if we crack down on the big banks, would that end racism?" And the crowd is like, "No, And in fact, so this is one of the core things that my book is trying actually to draw attention to, is that a lot of these types of struggles that we get into over symbols and status and this kind of stuff is just very far removed from doing anything meaningful.
I agree, and that's why I want to and your book. But the dissonance that I was feeling at a certain point, again, like taking that Uber example or taking the Amazon example, I don't recall, I'm sure you did probably say the word Jeff Bezos somewhere in the book, but the focus was so singularly, I did the audiobook version of it. Otherwise I would be going to a page and citing it specifically. This is why I prefer to have paperback book. That's my own fault. But you have this passage where you're really going in on the person who you talk in vivid and important detail about the plight of Amazon workers, and then focus all of this attention on the people who order on Amazon. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you, I don't think we should have Amazon. I don't think we should go to Whole Foods. Yeah, I support BDS, all of these things. But realistically speaking, I don't mean to say realistically speaking, I don't even want to say anything on this podcast that would give people a permission structure not to boycott. But the focus of my anger and frustration is on Amazon, is on Bezos, not on the person who orders their groceries in a pinch. Do you know what I mean? And
but Amazon exists to serve a consumer base, and the consumer base that Amazon serves more than anyone else in any other constituency is us.
Let's talk about this. How did Amazon and Uber both get in a position where they dominate the market in the way that they do? How did they do it? Both Amazon and Uber artificially lowered prices, used their money pre-existing from venture cap, the case of Uber, raising money from other rich people, venture capital style. Amazon, obviously, Bezos was already a very rich man off of selling the books on Amazon.com, et cetera, and decided to use their wealth to take a hit and not make profit for many, many years. I think Uber still doesn't make a profit.
Yeah.
To acculturate the public to expecting low prices, effectively put the taxi cab business out of business because they could not compete, have those people go into different sectors. And then once there was no competition, once also Amazon had eliminated the competition, raise prices again once they have taught the public to have certain consumption habits and expectations. That is coercive, manipulative behavior, which I blame Jeff Bezos on, and the corporations who should have been doing their job in terms of like antitrust law and the like, and the politicians who allowed them to do that, and the politicians who allowed them to stop this Uber legislation in California, et cetera, and not the consumers, not the workers who also consume, who happen to be caught in the midst of all of this. It feels, and here's why it matters to me. Here's why it matters to me.
But we're not just like normal, like the thing is we're actually the primary base.
Who is the we? Literally everybody.
Symbolic
Everybody
capitalism.
shops on Amazon. It's not just people who make $100,000 a year. In fact, I don't shop as much on Amazon because I can afford to just order from stores. I don't shop lower cost Amazon products, actually.
This is one of
to
the
be
things
honest.
I go over in the book, actually, is if you look at who is most likely to consume ride shares, who actually purchases from Amazon, most frequently, most consistently, it's actually people like us. And this is ironic in a way, because as you said, professionals who live in urban areas actually have a lot more shopping opportunities than people who live in a rural part of Kentucky or something like that.
Let's talk about that data. What does people like us mean? Do you have data on the professional managerial class shopping more on Amazon, or does the data say that people who earn between $60,000 and $150,000 a year shop more on Amazon?
Well, you can break it out both in terms of geography. So people who live in cities like New York consume Amazon, make more heavy use of Amazon than people who live in more rural areas.
Also,
And again,
Amazon
that's ironic.
is more available to people who live. There are many parts of the country where you can't get 2-day delivery, and it's not as available and cheap as it is if you live in an urban area,
the prices are basically the same, and you can actually get a lot more stuff that you certainly can't get at your local store in a small town in Kentucky. The amount of options that you'll have there, very small compared to the amount of options you have in New York.
So the data says that most Amazon is consumed by the people who live in the most populous parts of the country and earn like the median salary in the country. Because that doesn't surprise me. That
You can slice it a few ways, and what you see, a consistent pattern that you see, whether you're looking at who is it that takes Uber compared to other transportation, who is it that uses these ride shares the most aggressively? Who is it that consumes Amazon? Who is it that has the food delivered to them? Rather than
people with some disposable income. Yeah, that does not surprise me. That's not surprising to me.
It's not just people with disposable income. It tends to be urban professionals who do this. This is our lifestyle.
How does the data? How can you disaggregate the electrician who makes $150,000 a year using Uber from the professor who makes $150,000 a year who uses
in a few
Uber?
ways? So in some cases, so some of the services actually do have information on the working on the professions of the people who consume. Like even on social media sites, you can see what are the professions of the people who follow you on X, for instance. So that data is actually available for some of the platforms, and then you can also look at the intersection.
Uber knows who is riding in their cars because it's skimming their Facebook profiles to see if their friends are in certain professions, and then coming to the conclusion that is likely the profession of the person in the car?
No. So what I'm saying is social media sites often know your professions in all sorts of ways by aggregating all sorts of data.
But how do we know who's driving the Uber? Because I don't want to belabor the point, audience.
A lot of these companies also do in fact buy data from social media sites and integrate. This is it's a big privacy issue. There's not a lot of regulation on this when there should be. But then on top of that, they you can also look at, even if you look at the kind of if you just intersect look at interaction effects between things like the geographic regions that have the most, the socioeconomic brackets that have the most, the ethnic, all of these other factors that you can see
So people use Uber more in diverse cities where that also happen to be the most concentrated wealth because of the nature of cities. And that's how we know that it's more professors and not electricians. There's not electricians living. I bet there's more electricians in New York than there are in other parts of the country too, just because of a numbers issue.
Yeah, again, it's when you look at the interaction effects of these different variables that you can narrow down.
Okay, but this is all beside the point. Because what I was getting at though, it matters because of this. We are speaking one day after there was this huge victory of socialist candidates in New York City. Did you peep that?
Yeah.
Are you okay? All right. The Zoran Slate won. Mamdani Stan is here to stay. And the centrist Democrats and Zionist Republicans and everyone in between are losing their minds and trying to make the case that it doesn't really count actually because Daria Litsa didn't actually win Blacks and Latinos. She did, by the way. I think it's about 50-50 on the Black vote, but Batya Ungar-Sargon is making some kind of case for somehow that doesn't represent working class people. And this is the same narrative we get every single time there's a progressive victory, that the crowds are too white, that somehow this doesn't map on to the real working class. Therefore, we should, I don't know, go back to Mayor Bloomberg or something, right? Who had white crowds, but nobody really gave a damn. Or Eric Adams, who's, I guess, now somewhere in Albania, stuffing gold bars into his jacket. So I am very skeptical of these arguments because I can sit here and say, wow, this crowd of leftists in the middle of the day is too white. This must not be a real bottoms-up movement. Or I can say, of course, people who can come to a rally in the middle of a work day, in the middle of a work week, are going to be disproportionately advantaged. And I can say the kinds of people who are going to be able to engage in their spare time and these kinds of door knocking endeavors, et cetera, are going to be disproportionately advantaged. And we're living at a time when, as much as I think the criticism of the PMC is fair, you're describing a phenomenon where normally it's counter-cyclical, that when elites are doing well, poor aren't, and vice versa. But today, everyone's doing poorly. And they are forming political coalitions to advance the sincere economic, that go to the sincere economic benefit of both the middle class, the working class, and the poor, in the form of universal pre-K, for example, if we're talking about New York, free buses and public transportation benefits, childcare, after-school activity, these kinds of things, right? That are broadly distributed a la the Nordic model as opposed to being means-tested. And so when there's so much energy spent being angry, or like, it's not that if the criticism is PMC are easily weaponized to write hit pieces on Bernie Sanders, I'm with you. When it comes to PMC want to have their own class of chauffeurs to drive them around the country, and that's why Uber is able to exploit their workers, it starts to feel like, what? Because the only people who were really resisting that Uber legislation were all the PMC leftists who went to Oberlin, who were advocating at their local DSA chapters to try to stop that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so an example so I think there's a couple of things that are important. So again, one of the things that is important to note is that the decisions that people make in terms of their lifestyles and priorities actually do matter. Jeff Bezos is able to make a lot of money and Amazon by playing to desires that we have, and we are his primary market, and Uber and so on. They play into the desires that we have to have all of these kinds of services available to us cheap in a way that because if people could just have continued to take taxis, they took Ubers because it was cheaper, and they didn't really care that much about why it was cheaper or about what the implication was about why it was cheaper.
That's not entirely true. That's not true. But
it's not the case that they couldn't take. It's not the case that they couldn't take public transportation, and it's not the case that and you see this.
No. Uber was not a replacement for public transportation
or taxis.
As someone who was living in New York and I left New York in 2018, didn't even download Uber. until I moved to DC. Like, I think it was on the Bernie campaign, stranded somewhere in Iowa or something. And that's when I finally downloaded Uber. But like, I love a taxi. When you live in a place like New York and you can literally put your arm out and there is going to be a taxi, taxis are preferable because you don't have to wait. And they weren't cheap. Uber wasn't cheaper. What ended up happening was the availability of taxis started to decline because Uber put them out of business by artificially lowering the cost. And the price of taxi medallions is high. It's difficult to enter into the business because you have to pay a lot to start driving a taxi as opposed to start driving an Uber. And it was cost effective for people to switch from being taxi drivers to being Uber drivers, or to enter as Uber drivers before they more realistically upped the prices and the taxi industry had been decimated. You can't take that part out. It wasn't a bunch of yuppies sitting around saying, hey, I really want to hurt the taxi industry today.
No, it's that it's not a willful hurt. It's a lack of concern or thought about how these things happen. Like free 2-day shipping. How does free 2-day shipping happen? Most people who consume that service, and it's us who we don't know and we don't particularly care.
I don't think that's true. I don't think people don't know and they don't care.
I do think that's true. And I'll just give one other quick example as it relates to.
Okay.
So an example that I give in the book a lot is that if you look at places like the Upper West Side of Manhattan, or just, if you look at symbolic capitalists in general, we tend to consume a lot more childcare than other people. And a lot of white collar professionals really lean heavily on undocumented workers, and for a few reasons. One of which being that you can demand more of undocumented workers, and they don't have the same ability to push back. And two, you can pay them less. Now, of course, there's no law that says if you rely on an undocumented worker, you have to pay them less. That's a choice that people make. They see that someone is desperate and vulnerable, and they choose to pay them non-livable wages when they could, if they hired them at all, pay them the same as they would pay someone else. And the reason, and the response that they would often get is, well, but like, childcare is expensive. But the thing about it is, the reason why families rely so heavily.
Poor people are more virtuous than PMCs in not hiring undocumented labor, or are they just too poor to do it?
I think, well, it's not about being more virtuous.
It's obviously bad to exploit people's labor, but this weird division between the PMCs are like somehow uniquely like morally corrupt because the poor people aren't doing this. The poor people aren't doing this because they can't afford to do it. The poor people can't afford to do a lot of these things.
I'm not saying that they're more. I'm not saying, I never made the case in the book that the PMC people are any less moral. I'm just saying that they are the ones who are actually doing the exploitation in a way that other people are just not. As a fact, they just aren't. Whether they would is indifferent to the fact that they're not.
You refer to people using Ubers as wanting to have private chauffeurs at a certain point.
Yes.
And you're expecting me not to say to read into that you are trying to make a case against this particular the root of the evil of our system being rooted in the consumption habits of middle class people, as opposed to the exploitative industries that were designed to hook people. Look, we have let's come back to the New York.
You have to look at both.
Case.
Industries
let's come back to the New York case.
People.
What do you think just happened in New York? Because as I read you, as I understand you, you have a real problem with the very people that just elected Zohran Mamdani to be mayor of New York, who are disproportionately in the very class that you are criticizing here, symbolic capitalists, who has in his first 6 months managed to pass universal childcare and make it much less likely that some poor woman's immigrant labor is going to be exploited by the very members of the symbolic capitalist class because they have childcare options. So what do you make of that dynamic?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of an implicit misunderstanding of my politics here. So I'm a socialist. I actually, in fact, as I said, I think the kind of model that the United States needs to go towards is universalized benefits and more consistent, broader-based taxation that's kind of closer to what most other peer countries do. But in terms of Mamdani, I have an essay on my Substack called "The Graveyard of Bad New York City Mayoral Election Narratives" or something like that, where I actually bring a whole bunch of data to challenge a lot of these kinds of anti-woke narratives that were mobilized against Zoran Mamdani in the 2024 election. One of the things that's really interesting, actually, if you look at the voters who put Mamdani into office, is that he did draw from a somewhat wide socioeconomic base. In fact, one thing that's really interesting and unique, and that's resonant with what I said earlier, is that if you look at a thing that's interesting that people on the right make too much of and actually don't pay attention to one side of this, is that Mamdani did the best with people he did the worst, better said, with the least affluent and the most affluent New Yorkers. So the super rich New Yorkers and the poorest New Yorkers were the least supportive of Zoran Mamdani. And the same thing is true along the lines of education, actually. Some of the and so the kind of the highest upper class people and the lowest class people were the most skeptical. And on the lower end, that's because a lot of working class people are conservative not in the kind of liberal conservative way, but conservative in the sense of they don't like to gamble. Like they're kind of reserved. They're cautious. They're more cautious about unproven ideas, about people they're not familiar with. They're kind of more likely to lean on what they think of as safe bets. And that explains the low end. But Mamdani actually did well throughout the entire middle of the income distribution and had broad-based support across educational lines. In this slate of races in the primaries that just happened, as you said, a thing that you do see in the data is that some of the candidates in the Mamdani slate candidates did do non-trivially better in neighborhoods that are associated with higher levels of education, higher levels of affluence, less white voters. But even that varies from candidate to candidate. Lander actually did pretty well, did better with minority voters than the others, and none of them did especially horribly with minority voters. Although they did also across the board. All three of those candidates were somewhat weak with lower income voters. Again, not because lower income voters are more cautious. They're more conservative in that way, in the kind of small c way, not the liberal conservative way. But they'll come around. So one of the things that you saw with AOC, for instance, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is that during her primary, people noted that the same kind of trend. Crowley did better. His strongest districts were actually the Black and Hispanic and lower income districts. AOC did really well in the more affluent districts and so on. But one thing that's interesting, that's the primary, is that when you went to the general election then, she won 78% of the vote. So a lot of the people who voted for Crowley in the primary went on to just vote for AOC in the general election. And she's easily won re-election every time since that she stood, although her margins have been getting a little bit smaller in more recent cycles, but still it's like a 2-to-1, actually closer to a 3-to-1 vote that she's winning every time. And so I suspect that something very similar will happen with these other candidates as well. They're making a big hay over the primary thing, but when you go to the general election, it's likely that each of these candidates is probably going to win by something too close to a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 margin pretty easily over their rivals. And so I think people are kind of overinterpreting these results. So is it true that some of these candidates have?
Okay, but this is what I'm going to try to get you to engage on, though, Musa, is how are the people who are trying to detract from the wins last night or from Zoran Mamdani's win or from AOC's win, who say things like, this is, I'm reading off of Twitter, Booker G. Washington, he's one of these big Democrat establishment booster guys, says, so the lesson I learned from these New York City elections is that DSA is not a pure working class people's movement. Lots of white college educated yuppies doing their good gentrification work up in Harlem/uptown. Also, DSA and MAGA are willing to double down on the hateful rhetoric. And there's a picture of a bunch of joyful socialists at a party. I guess they're not sufficiently brown for him. Another example by Alicia Neves, who is a columnist at Unheard, says, who attends your election party is a reflection of your core base. Here we see the true DSA base, suburban educated white transplants who use edgy politics to justify their active displacement of working class urban people of color. Okay, this idea, whether or not it's even true in this case, that this is not, you say this at one point in your book, it's so such and such wasn't a bottom-up movement. There's too many white people involved. It's not sufficiently diverse. It's not enough working class people involved in this movement. If you are making the observation that people who don't share class interests with poor and working class people are pushing a movement in a direction that's antithetical to their interest, like Black Lives Matter people using money for a hype house instead of trying to get police reform, I agree with the criticism. But when you have a coalition like you have on the left right now of, yes, a bunch of elites that went to Oberlin or Wesleyan or whatever, fighting for candidates that support a minimum wage raise and free childcare and universal health care and all of these kinds of things that also map on to what the broad public actually wants, what actually is the criticism here of these symbolic capitalists? Symbolic capitalists got this slate elected last night. What's the problem?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. So my problem is only the problem that I try to point out in the book is twofold. One, in cases where people are advocating for policies in the name of the marginalized and the disadvantaged that just clearly demonstrably go against what the people they're trying to help actually want and actually value. Like, I think that's a problem. And then the second problem is related to that, is when they engage in kinds of rhetoric and political display that not only fails to resonate with the people they say they're advocating for, but that actually ends up empowering reactionary kind of politics, I have a problem with as well. So for instance, one of the things I show in the book is that these periods of awakening are often followed by these anti-wokening periods. And the reason why that happens is because during these periods of awakening, the gap between people who work in the symbolic professions and a lot of the rest of the public gets a lot bigger because we shift a lot while they stay on the same trend that they've been on. And we notice the gap growing bigger, and we assume the reason the gap is growing bigger is because these people are growing more, whatever, racist, sexist, whatever. But actually, when you look at the data, their trend lines are basically the same. It's us that are doing the shifting. Okay, but the gap doesn't just grow bigger. People become more aware of the gap between us and them, in large part because of how we conduct ourselves. So during these periods of heightened contestation, we sometimes, often, lean much more heavily into mocking, harassing, deriding, censoring people who disagree with us, even for views that we adopted symbolic capitalists as a group. So in academia, for instance, in journalism, in a lot of these other fields, you can look at changes in discourse, you can look at changes in policy. You see a lot more aggressive kind of policing of divergent views during these periods, not just in this latest episode, but in previous ones. But this becomes a problem then, because it's not like a lot of the people who complain about that kind of stuff are themselves insanely censorious, as becomes clear in these anti-wokening periods. So what happens is the gap between us and other people grows bigger. People become more aware of the gap because of how we conduct ourselves. And this creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs, usually associated with the right, to basically campaign on bringing people like us back under control. So you see these narratives about, oh, universities are just indoctrinating the young people instead of teaching them useful knowledge and skills. And the media is just an indoctrination factory they hate you, they don't respect you, they're not telling you the truth. These kinds of narratives become popular in the aftermath of each of these periods of awakenings, in part because we actually are behaving in a way that is very different and unusual and off-putting to a lot of people, and they notice it.
Yeah, I asked who the we is because I think it gets to the core of why we're coming from to this from slightly different angles. The phenomenon you describe, I'm only cutting you off because I think we talk about this all the time on this show, right? So the audience is very clear about the way that this plays out in the public. But for whatever reason, the way that in the book the focus is so on the identity of symbolic capitalists functions, purposefully or not, into turning them into a kind of identity category of their own that is described as having impulses that are sort of rooted intrinsically the way that we talk about standpoint epistemology. Let me ask a Black person to weigh in on this because they're Black. Well, this is what a Black person is going to think. This is what a symbolic capitalist is going to think. Symbolic capitalists like to consume in these ways. So symbolic capitalists are indifferent to their consumption habits for X, Y, and Z. Symbolic capitalists are driving these things. I come to it from a little bit of a different perspective. I don't disagree that the establishment media promulgates certain narratives. I don't disagree that establishment politicians amplify certain identity politics or cultural concerns the way that Hillary Clinton did in that famous, well, breaking up the banks did racism. But to me, the reason that they're doing that and that they are publishing journalists to do that and choosing editorially to push that perspective, it's because it's elites, genuine elites, not some professor making $100,000 a year, but people who have millions and billions of dollars who very much don't want the system to change in the ways that someone like a democratic socialist like Bernie Sanders would want them to change. So they hire and employ in academic institutions, in media institutions. They'll buy entire media institutions. Gaza has shown that billionaires will force out presidents and basically purchase academic institutions, as Bill Ackman did, in order to make sure that a certain kind of non-threatening to capital leftism is pushed forward. I don't know if you're familiar with Gabriel Rockhill's work, but I've enjoyed talking to him on the podcast as well about how this is all driven by an effort to obscure natural class alliances that are happening, as we're seeing in New York, across the broad 99% against the very 1% who are the only ones that are benefiting from increased productivity and science gains and all technological gains over the last 50, 60 years. And to me, if I have one last sentence, if I have a political project that is prescriptive and not just descriptive, because at the end of your book, you're like, my job is not kind of to tell you what to do with this or what to do next, which is fair enough, most kind of academic books in that way. But I have a different project. And to me, there's not much I can do about the idea that, some yuppie annoyed me with their coexist lawn sign. What I can do is actually encourage that yuppie to realize that their identity of interest is with the working class and the poor, and say, you also have childcare needs, and also you don't feel great about exploiting your Haitian nanny. And so maybe we should get someone like Zohran Mamdani in office who can give us better childcare options.
Yeah, so I think one thing that can help square the circle here is a thing that I stress a lot in my book is that the anti-woke and the kind of right-leaning symbolic, the people who end up winning power in the aftermath of these periods of heightened contestation, they tend to think about and approach politics in basically the exact same way as the people they were criticizing. So Trump took office. What are some of the big things that the Trump administration has focused on? Oh, we're going to build monuments. Oh, we're going to rename a bunch of things. Oh, we're going to, the Gulf of Mexico is now the Gulf of America. We're going to bring Columbus Day back. We're going to, all this other kind of nonsense. And that is in part because they share a lot of the same ways of talking and thinking about the world. The only way that you come to a place where you would say something like, this nonsense happening on Middlebury campus is a threat to Western civilization, is if you also think that symbols matter a lot, that symbols matter so much that they're of world historical importance to the point where the kind of other kinds of normal needs of ordinary people to take a back seat to this culture war struggle. The people who work in the symbolic profession, one thing that you do see, you can see it in a few ways. You can look at studies looking at political behaviors. You can look at studies at what types of candidates resonate with which types of voters. There's a whole bunch of different types of analysis that you can do. One thing that comes through clearly, very consistently in literature in a number of fields, is that the kind of people who work in the symbolic professions, we actually do think about and approach politics a little different than other people, in part, in one way that's very important, is that we do tend to focus a lot more on things like discourse and representation and symbols, because to us, and there's a reason for that, a very material, practical, economical reason, namely that our lives and our livelihoods are oriented around symbols. They're like literally important to us in a way that is different from other workers.
Is that true, or do we just have different symbols? Is that true? I mean, I
No, I think it is. It is true. It's true even in the sense that.
But to your point, the conservatives have their symbols,
yeah.
right? PMCs have their symbols, our symbols, and working class people on the right and the left.
Yeah, this is the reason why anti-wokenings actually tend to fizzle out too, is because this kind of niche. So, like the lesson. There's a couple, like when you look, like the lesson that Republicans could have learned from 2024 was that people are tired of all this culture war nonsense. They have real problems and they want to focus on those problems. That's not the lesson they learned. The lesson that they took from 2024 was they're done with left-leaning culture wars. What they really want is right-leaning culture wars.
Because they can't learn any other lesson. This is my concern with the lens that's being applied here. It's not that they don't know, right? Just like the liberals knew, the Democrats know that Gaza was unpopular. Kamala Harris didn't double down on it out of ignorance. It's because they don't have a choice. But you don't get Elon Musk and Marianne Adelson's money to then go and have a pogrom against the 1%. To go and say, I'm gonna divest from giving Israel any more money, stop funding the Iron Dome, and stop funding the military contracts that have made Elon Musk a trillionaire. You don't have the choice, because it's not that they are deciding that the culture war is their priority because they think it's politically advantageous. They know that the only way to create the fiction that we had two parties with two options while still maintaining a billionaire-driven elite status quo is to play in the sandbox of shit that doesn't matter, which is the culture stuff. And by it doesn't matter, I don't mean it doesn't actually matter. I just mean that it doesn't matter materially to the elites.
Well, no, but it does matter materially to the. So take Donald Trump. Donald Trump's businesses went bankrupt multiple times. Like the only reason Donald Trump is not like both in jail and broke was because he made this aggressive pivot from the kind of businesses he was doing before towards the symbolic professions. He started doing movies and television shows. He was in Little Rascals and Home Alone 2, and he did WWE, and he had The Apprentice, and then he was licensing his brand, and he's a symbolic capitalist.
Wait. The real estate wasn't symbolic professions? Him being a real estate mogul wasn't considered to be a symbolic profession? He wasn't a PMC before with his Wharton degree and his...
Yeah. So no, this is my point. He was a symbolic, and Vance's as well, and Hegseth, and a lot of these people. Like Hegseth was the Fox News, so this was the last thing he was doing. Vance, and so like the kind of mentalities that they exhibit, the ways that they think about and approach politics are actually not very different. Actually, at the end of the day, at a very fundamental level, are actually not very different from a lot of the woke people that they're criticizing. They tend to focus on the same kinds of things, and they think the same kinds of things are important. And again, they actually are, like Donald Trump's billions, at least before he became president again and really aggressively did this kind of graft that, but up until the point he became president, the money he had was mostly built out of cultivating and leveraging symbolic capital. So like these kinds of symbol things actually are like important in a very direct pecuniary way for Donald Trump, and they always have been. And so this is part of why he fixates on this kind of stuff. Is because it's like literally important to him. And the same thing with Vance and a lot of these other people. And I think one of the kind of and so what you often see in these periods of awakening and anti-awakening is that there's this growing gap I mentioned. It gets the kind of right steps in and does this kind of slate of other culture war stuff that also fails to address or meaningfully even speak to the needs of ordinary people. And they usually end up getting pushed out for that reason as well. And what usually happens then is there comes to be a period where both parties kind of moderate to find some way to talk more to ordinary people's concerns. And there's this kind of and become more competitive. And so there's this kind of period in between these periods where the parties are actually more competitive with each other, and each of them try to speak in some way to things that voters actually care about. But the
like, can you give an example? When did that happen last?
sure. So like so in between the last awakening and the current one, there was actually a pretty significant set of restructuring of the economy. There were changes to
When would this have been?
like so for instance, and actually these during the Clinton years and then the Bush 1 years, there were a lot of aggressive focus on things like crime and social welfare, things like this. Now the policies that ended up and this is in part because like the focus on crime was in part because a lot of people, especially less affluent people, they actually do have legitimate concerns about public safety and public order, real concerns that are not being adequately addressed. And to the extent that they feel like unsafe, that they feel that things are not well in control, this creates a space where people on the right can again campaign on this aggressive on this kind of on this set of policies that actually don't solve a lot of the problems. I have an essay recently on my Substack on this called "On Crime and Punishment" or something like that, where I delve into this a little bit. But that's an example of a concrete concern that people have: public safety, public order, that rises in salience during these periods.
During when? Sorry, I'm just trying to, because I see crime as another one of the, for lack of a better word, cultural footballs. It's not that crime isn't real, but discussion. Alec Karatkasanis has done a great job in his book, Propaganda. It's here behind me, about how the relationship between the media's coverage of crime bears basically no relationship to actual high crime rates. Okay. So to that extent, it is a cultural football. It's not like an actual interest in crime driven by the reality of the world. It's a thing to talk about, to vilify your opponent, because there is a perception that Republicans are better able to lower crime rates than Democrats.
My point is just that when people talk less about what's happening at colleges and universities, topics like crime are more likely to rise. Topics like public safety and public order are more likely to become central to the discourse when people start talking less about woke students at Columbia. Was my point. But yeah, no, I agree that there's not actually a meaningful correlation between, like, it's not that crime increases during these periods. It's that as discussion about these other things goes down, and political entrepreneurs are trying to find some other issue to draw leverage on and gain traction over, since they can't just say woke students Columbia anymore. They lean on these other kinds of issues that are closer to real problems that people actually care about.
Well, in fact, a woke Columbia student who ran precisely because her representative wasn't attendant to Mahmoud al-Khalil, who was arrested and detained for over a year for his pro-Palestine advocacy.
She just won.
She is now the new representative of her district, and she was one of those woke Columbia students. And they tried to get her on crime and some 2020 era tweets. And I talked to Alex Vitale on the last episode of Bad Faith Podcast about how she managed to weather the storm in part with his advice without backing away from her criminal justice commitments. And I think that we live in a whole new era. So kudos to Darliza. But maybe I'll land the plane this way, since you've been very patient with me mooting this and going back and forth for over 2 hours now.
Oh.
I know time flies when you're having fun, huh? Prescriptively, I know that you say that the book isn't prescriptive, but it was published last year. It feels like the world is changing rapidly. I personally was sort of shocked by how little salience woke seems to have had in the 2024 election. I was joking, not joking, about how my moment with Bethany Mandel about define woke seems to have been the last time woke was really centered by the right as a political cudgel. I feel like they took a big L and no one was really talking about it after that. I think that was 2023. Going forward, would you write differently or frame anything in your book differently, seeing political trends emerge like what we've seen in New York, where it doesn't, I'm struggling at least to see how the critique of PMCs as a class is relevant in the successes or played a role in the successes of these sort of new Mamdani era woke 2.0 politicians, where the purported the real differences in class and interests that have in the past been weaponized to prevent action on behalf of the lower tranche of society. In this case, these elites, these symbolic capitalists, seem to be faithfully shepherding forward the policy agenda that genuinely is a working class policy agenda. How do you make sense of that?
Yeah. So I'll just note quickly on my Substack for people who are interested in, I do have some essays where I kind of extend the analysis of my book into the present. There's one called The Graveyard of Bad New York City Mayoral Election Narratives that I would recommend on Mamdani in particular. There's one called The Cultural Contradictions of the Anti-Woke, which kind of look at this Trump 2.0 administration and why it's destroying itself. But one of the things I think Mamdani is actually really exemplary here, where he focused really tightly on bread and butter issues that people care about across the board. So there were attempts by Cuomo, there were attempts sometimes by activists to try to pull Mamdani into taking a bunch of stands and spending a lot of time talking about, kind of niche issues that are not related to everything from gender and sexuality stuff to stuff about
did that happen?
The Middle East. Yeah,
they were trying to get him to say something about gender and sexuality that he didn't already say.
Yeah, there were attempts to make it more central to the conversation. And in fact, you could even see this in some of the debates where Cuomo or one of the other or a moderator or even in some of his interviews with journalists, they'll raise some kind of issue that is orthogonal to what other people are most concerned about, and he would pivot to focus.
I don't disagree that he was had a lot of message discipline, but I'm just trying to. I want to be specific about this. Was there some leftist somewhere that I missed that was trying to get him to say something more different about LGBT issues, and he said no, I don't, and I'm walking back my stance on trans rights or whatever?
No, this is what's beautiful about, and I think actually where Mamdani is a model that other Democrats can draw from. Is the issue is it's not that you it's not that you have to take like there's this kind of narrative that what Democrats have to do in order to win is to kind of take squishy middle positions on everything and whatever. I actually disagree with that assessment. I think it's absolutely possible to take almost any position you want. The issue, there's kind of two things that are important though. You can't let niche issues that are not the primary concerns of a lot of voters dominate the messaging in the campaign. You need to stay as focused, the most focused on what voters actually care about. You can have issues on all sorts of things, but your primary messaging needs to be about what voters actually care about. And it's also important in terms of how you talk about these issues in ways that will resonate with people. So Jacobin and YouGov have this great study called Common Sense Solidarity, where one of the things they show is there's this perception that working class people, they don't care about the environment. They don't care about misogyny. They don't care about racial inequality and so on. And what they find is that's not true. What is true is that people who are highly educated, relatively affluent professionals tend to have very different types of political messaging that resonates with them compared to working class people, and very different types of policy prescriptions. So, for instance, working class people tend to prefer messaging that appeals to what people have in common and superordinate identities and shared values, common goals. Whereas a lot of highly educated professionals think that it's really important to center race and sexuality. And if you fail to make that the central thing you talk about, then in some way you're not being real.
Yeah.
And in terms of policy prescriptions, professionals like to tend to prefer policies that are really targeted along the lines of race or gender or sexuality, whereas working class people prefer more universal. No, but my point is just that there is a so if I were giving advice,
but why is there that difference? Why is there that difference? This goes to the core of what I think our disagreement.
Well, but what I'm saying is, if I were giving advice to Democrats, my advice, and I think Mamdani exemplifies this advice, exemplifies these kind of best practices, is to just not. Is that you don't have to water down or abandon your progressive views. What you do have to do.
They don't want that advice. They know they don't want the advice.
Well, but what you do have to do is talk about issues that voters care about, and in ways that will actually resonate with working people, which are a little different than the ways that will resonate with other.
But they can't, because their donor base doesn't want them to talk about universal policies that cost money and that prevent the control of the ownership class over the labor force. Amazon doesn't want people to have Medicare for all, because then they'll quit their jobs.
Well, I think it's an intersection of can't and won't, like in the sense that I think that, well, one thing that I've seen when I've talked to other professionals about these kinds of things, academics, journalists, people who work in the NGO space, is you can tell them sometimes, and I can even show them studies that will convey to them that if you talk about the issue this way versus this way, it's going to be more persuasive to a broader range of people. And in some cases, they just don't care, because to them, what's important is being.
This is where we disagree. Like, I don't think all of these explanations that are like the spirit of upper middle class people at PMCs is that they resist. They want to understand the world a certain way. They don't want to understand the world a certain way. They just read the Atlantic.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying they want to. I'm not attributing motive. I'm just describing patterns.
Wait a minute. They believe what they believe because the New York Times and the Atlantic tell them what to believe. Why is the messaging of the New York Times and the Atlantic what it is? Because they are owned by the very elites that want there to be a focus on quote unquote. They hire Nicole Hannah-Jones and make her a star because Nicole Hannah-Jones is going to push. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones believes what she's saying. She is not cynical, but they chose her and made her a star because that kind of race first framing is guaranteed to derail a class first or class at all narrative. Because what Nicole Hannah-Jones says is we can't talk about class disparities until racism is cured. And if I were a billionaire who owned a newspaper, I would say, fantastic. Let's give her a whole 1619 project. Let's put her on the cover of every magazine, because that agenda is one that's never going to threaten my bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I think it's also true that we actually are we're just more sensitive. Again, there's just a lot of data that shows that we actually are more sensitive to some of these differences than a lot of other people. We cue in on them more for a whole bunch of reasons. And
what differences? Sorry, what differences?
On anything from like, so one thing that you see is again and again and again in the literature is that highly educated liberal people are actually more attentive. They are genuinely, actually, truly more attentive to race in a lot of respects than even conservatives, but certainly compared to people who are just
what does it mean to be more
an
attentive to
example.
race?
There's some work on what's called competence downshifting, which is when people talk in a simpler way. Like if you ask someone, what do you do? And you describe, if I'm talking to you and I describe what I do, and then I'm talking to this person and describe what I do, what you can see in studies, for instance, is that white liberals, if they're talking to a black person, when you ask them, what do you do? They talk about what they do in simpler language as if they're talking to a child. And when they talk to a white person answering the exact same question, they answer in a very different way. Now, you don't see this effect actually with conservatives or moderates, and you can see this, and you can see a lot. And this is an example of someone is cueing into a racial difference, and they're trying to build a bridge, and like it's kind of a well-intentioned thing. It's actually not, So Fanon actually observed this in Black Skin, White Mask. Frantz Fanon actually observed this as well, like decades before these kinds of studies were being done today. But this is a kind of thing that happens when people are really cued into race, really worried about these differences and managing these differences and wanting people across difference to care, to like them and relate to them. So this kind of hyperfixation actually leads them to treat people differently along the lines of race.
The soft bigotry of low expectations.
But so there's a lot of work that shows that we actually pay attention to these differences and they govern our behaviors in ways that are unique.
Okay.
And again, this is a kind of way that we think about and approach a lot of issues that separates us from other people. And
so
again, what I think Mamdani was really effective about was really focusing on broad-based policies, on really sticking to the issues that he wanted to talk about and not letting other people define the race, not letting other people define the core issues. He had his issues, and those were the things that he talked about. And he talked about those issues largely, again, in terms of common values, shared goals, superordinate identities. He could have said, oh, well, the reason why we want to make buses free is, and then went on a whole bunch of long conversation about racial disparities and how this is going to fight white supremacy. And that's not what he did, right? And so this is an example, I think, of a way that you can actually work to address problems that disproportionately affect poor people or Black people or women or queer people without.
I agree. And I would say that I wrote an article, I believe in 2018, maybe 2018, that was a pushback against a Ta-Nehisi Coates piece in New York Mag that made the case that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I have a lot of respect for, but have been, and Nicole Hannah-Jones and that whole ilk, Jamel Bouie's, all of them, notably the class of Black public intellectuals that was uplifted by the New York Times and the Atlantic and all of these elite journals, who were all pushing this idea that there had to be a specific racial agenda, that there had to be these racial articulations of policies, that if you didn't frame something in racial terms, it meant that you were basically a racist. And they would argue at the same time that America was uniquely racist, that Trump was the first white president, all of these kinds of things. And I pointed out in this article that you can't have it both ways. If America is as racist as you're saying it is, which fair enough, why do you want to make sure that every policy that broadly benefits everyone, including white people who can constitute the majority of America's poor, should only be read through racial terms? So I very much agree with you on that. The only difference that I would say is that the reason I believe that elites, PMCs, whatever, subscribe to that ideology, the race-first ideology, is because they were indoctrinated into it by this class of journalist professionals that were hired for the purpose of doing so unwittingly. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates is now going through a sort of like come to Jesus moment where he's reflecting on his career and the role that he played in all of this, and God bless him for it. Good for him. Like, I don't expect everyone to be perfect. I appreciate all of that reflection. And I would love for him to come on Bad Faith and talk about it sometime.
Well, so I think you see this combination of genuine values and material interests. So one of the things, like if you're in academia, depending on your field, one of the things that you learn, especially at particular moments, like in this period, say between 2010 and 2020, is that say you're actually concerned and troubled about racial injustice on the one hand, and you also realize that a good way to get ahead in your career, to get your thing published, to be held up in higher esteem among your colleagues, is to really aggressively center race and talk about your anti-racist bona fides, then there's this convergence, right, between your values and your interests. And so it's not the case that, again, as you said, that people are being cynical or insincere, but recognizing that people are sincere is not in tension with the idea that they're doing things.
No, I agree. The point that I'm trying to make is that this is more of a Chomsky style. It's not like the CIA telling you what to do. It's that these institutions simply uplift the people that have the messaging that's convenient to them. Yeah. And so it feels like choice. Like if you ask Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you ask Nicole Hannah-Jones, were you forced to say anything? They would say no, but that doesn't mean that propaganda is still not in effect.
Absolutely. I have an essay that you would like called "Censorship is primarily a problem of institutional selection,"
right,
on my Substack, where this is one of the things I know, and I quote the Chomsky quote about the great Chomsky quote about how when he talks to journalists about this kind of thing, they go, "No one tells me what to write," and they're like, "You're absolutely right. No one tells you what to write. But if you didn't already think and write the right things, you wouldn't be writing for the New York Times."
Exactly. But this is an important distinction, though, and I want to make sure this is really. I want to make this really clear. What I'm describing is a group of people, when the PMCs feel differently than the working class, my argument is that they have been indoctrinated by these elite publications that they're reading, right? They're targeted to them. It's like, why do old people like centrist politicians? Okay, old people disproportionately consume cable news. Young people disproportionately consume TikTok. So there's a big gap between perceptions on the war on Gaza, for instance, the genocide in Gaza, among the old and the young. I think a similar thing is happening with PMCs who sit around reading the Atlantic and the New York Times and feeling good about themselves, and most people who don't have time for that.
Well, I think that's part of it. I think definitely it's the case that when people who are of these highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban kind of backgrounds are enculturated from K-12 schools through college into thinking about the world in a certain way. And actually, this is one of the things I show in the book, is like this actually starts in K-12 schools. If you look at the K-12 curriculum of the kinds of private schools that professionals send their kids to, they tend to be much more aggressively social justice oriented than public schools. Even though the whole point of that school of these private schools is to help elites reproduce their elite social position, right? But one of the things that this discourse also serves, though, is it does help mark someone. So part of it is sincere belief, but part of it, I think, is also a desire to distinguish themselves from especially the bad people. So we talk about these issues in a way that shows that I
think that's true. But the bad people, the way that it's framed in the book, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's not just I want to distinguish myself from like, ew, gross poor people. It's more than that. It's distinguishing themselves from the bad rich people. Like, to me, the function, I'm thinking of certain, highly educated, white academic, boomer types in my life who very much read The Atlantic and very much want to talk about race in these ways, who probably do the soft bigotry of low expectations that you were describing, and they're a little weird around Black people because, they want so badly not to seem racist. Okay, I observe all of that. But to me, the reason they want to go all in on race is because they want to distinguish themselves from their rich white Republican friend in the boardroom. It's not like, to me, like some of the stuff about like, the elites want to distinguish themselves from the poor and the Walmart worker. Like, of course that's true. Like, of course there are class benefit. Like, there are class signifiers that get you social capital in the world, and that is what it is. But it is also true that I think there's something. It's more holistic. It's bigger. It's bigger than just people who are kind of living on the margins, whose salaries aren't necessarily higher than a quote unquote traditional working class, a person with a working class job, but who can grasp these things. It's the actual elites, the people who actually are in control and are in charge, and not the adjunct professor. It's the $500,000 a year owning folks and up who are driving the consumption of the media and who are on TV being talking heads, promulgating certain messaging that is very convenient to the 1%, where they desperately want to seem like they're okay, despite not wanting their taxes to go up, despite genuinely not having identity of interest with an adjunct professor or an electrician because they can afford to have healthcare and they have it through their job or whatever. But to still want to seem like a good person. It's the person who doesn't really like Bernie, because Bernie seems to be unsettling the status quo a little too much, but doesn't want to seem like they're a bad guy, so they go all in on Elizabeth Warren. That's who this stuff is for.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So this is one of the things I stress in the book is that there's kind of two kinds of distinction that are happening at once here. On the one hand, people are trying to distinguish themselves from the poor and so on, working class people who are not as educated as them and so on. But then they also are, as you said, and actually this is what I was talking about, what I tried to stress in those parts about elite overproduction and so on. They're also trying to distinguish themselves from other people in their social circles, right? Either competitors on the job markets, people who are above, as you said, who are above them, and so on. And so I think this kind of discourse serves a lot of kind of social signaling functions for us. But the thing I try to stress in the book is like, for all that, the one thing that a lot of this kind of really aggressively social justice oriented rhetoric doesn't often do is actually help genuinely disadvantaged people in society. And it's sometimes easy to lose track of like, well, what's actually happening for working class people in society when we get into these really, aggressive conflicts over words and symbols and labels and representation and so on. And so that, that's one of the things I was trying to use this book as an opportunity to do, is to have people kind of step back from these culture war things and actually look at how the superstructure relates to the base and kind of Marxist terminology.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't know that you answered my question about how you see symbolic capitalists and if you see them differently in light of the fact that they do seem to be advancing the genuine economic program of the middle class, working class, and poor in places like New York. Does that make you feel differently about setting them apart as a class that seems to have unique sort of stultifying effects on economic movements?
Well, no, I mean, so I think, so one of the founders of critical race theory, Bell, he argued that most of the time when you see good things happening for Black people, in this case, because he was critical race theory, so he was looking at that lens, but it's in these moments where there's convergent interests, and that if things aren't useful for whites, then they probably won't happen for Blacks. But there are moments when things are useful for white people too. And
you talk about the Vietnam War in this. You say that the Vietnam War protests didn't really start. There's a narrative that it was about resisting the draft, but truthfully, there was a draft, but college-educated people or college kids were excluded from it, and the college protests didn't begin until they changed the rules, and now suddenly college kids were draft eligible.
Well, and so one way that you could look at the kind of contemporary moment is that there are convergent interests around some issues that are being focused on here, like childcare. So professionals are actually some of the biggest consumers of childcare. They actually consume childcare more intensely and a lot more than most other workers. And so this is a kind of policy that would benefit ordinary workers, but would disproportionately benefit professionals. Now, there's nothing wrong, in my view. The fact that it would disproportionately benefit professionals doesn't make it bad. Like, it's fine if people have interests and they're pursuing their interests, and in the process of pursuing their interests, they're also helping other people.
But also, Musa, why do you think professionals consume more childcare?
Huh?
Why do you think professionals consume more childcare? If everyone has kids, why do professionals need more childcare, consume more childcare than poor people?
Yeah, so I go into this in some of my essays, but one of the reasons is that they're more likely to aggressively pursue a dual earner model. If you have two people who both have postgraduate degrees and they both want high-powered careers, the only way to make that work out is if you have a lot of childcare. If you have other relationships where one of the partners wants to stay home, they didn't go to college, they don't have good career, like really aggressive career aspirations, or where both of the partners have kind of more part-time work or whatever, then it's easier to adjust.
And if you have two people working outside of the home, you also have a double income that can start to support more childcare consumption, right?
Yeah, one of the ironies is that a lot of the second income in these dual earner models
just goes to childcare,
goes to hiring other women to do the women's work.
Right.
So other people cook meals, other people watch the kids, other people.
Right. So again, we have a societal issue where we haven't updated our sense of free time, childcare. Maybe we should have a 3-day work week. Maybe we should definitely have more parental leave opportunities. All of these things that are driving this consumption, quote unquote overconsumption of childcare among the more affluent, and also the fact that lower income people who may or may not be single parents and who have frankly more childcare need potentially because they're working longer shifts and more jobs might be consuming less than they actually need to consume simply because they can't afford to.
Well, and childcare actually becomes less affordable for those folks in part as a function of how much more affluent folks are consuming the childcare and the rates that they're willing to pay to get this kind of intensive childcare. It makes buying that same kind of labor less affordable for other folks who are in more urgent need. But but yeah. So I mean, I think this is a case where some of the things that are being prioritized are where there's kind of convergent interests there, where it's not that they're promoting things for working people that are not in their own interest to promote. It's that they're promoting things that are in their interest to promote, but that are also useful for working people. And I think focusing on those areas where you do have these shared interests and common goals is absolutely.
It's a good thing. So this is I think this. Sorry, I keep saying this. This gets to the heart of art, but I do think this gets to the heart of something that I was feeling as I was reading, which is that periodically, including with the example of the Vietnam War, the implication. I'm not saying this is your intention, but what it comes across as is, well, these elite college kids didn't give a damn about the draft until they were going to get drafted, and it's like, well, yeah, I would love everyone to be benevolent and just care about everything in the world all the time. But it is a very normal thing to have your self-interest at heart. Just like working class people have their self-interest at heart. They have economic needs that I don't have. I have, I don't need a $15 minimum wage. I don't need a $20 minimum wage, but I still advocate for it. But it's not going to be, so there's a way that sometimes you talk about, like, you write about, student, these elites, they went to college and they took out all this debt, and now there's no jobs for a PhD student, and so now they care about voting for Bernie or whatever. That's not exactly what but you know what I'm getting at. They might superficially support a kind of a leftism, or say that they care about the poor because they have overlapping interests now with the poor because they can't get good jobs and they have all this debt.
Well, in some cases, they actually don't. So the issue to me is not when there are these overlapping interests. The issue to me is when they actually don't have overlapping interests, but they say, instead of saying that they're advocating this thing because it's advantageous to them, and sometimes even comes at the expense of other people,
But
They, they,
that's not really true, Musa, because that's not the example that you write about at length with the Vietnam War.
well, so the
What was the
Vietnam,
point of bringing up? Go ahead.
yeah, so the example of the Vietnam War, one of the things that's instructive there was what I'm trying to do in that chapter is just to, in that section, is just to explain the timing of why these kind of big um, periods of awakening happen when they do. So that's all I'm trying to do is just explain why does the timing happen then rather than this other time? Why isn't it just always happening? And so I was just trying to answer that narrow question, but I'll add, one of the things that's interesting there, one thing that I think is important about that case is up until the point where the draft laws changed, they were apathetic. And so this is my point that I was making before, is a lot of these folks who define themselves in terms of social justice are in fact genuinely apathetic about a lot of social problems, even though before that they were still like left-leaning people. It's just they didn't spend their time on Vietnam advocacy because Vietnam advocacy didn't affect them. And so, this kind of apathy is noteworthy. And the fact that they why is it noteworthy? Well, it's just what I said before, and I received pushback when I was like, well, they're trying to receive these benefits from Uber and Amazon, and they don't really care how they happen. This is another example like that, where until they're paying, like they didn't care particularly about the war in Vietnam or who was waging it until it became a problem for them. And then they often position themselves as being people who always cared about this, who are deeply moved by it, and it's their core value that they're when in fact it's just not the case if you just look at their previous behavior. And this is the issue, right?
So are you mad at the people in New York right now? Do you want to have discourse about how the people in New York who voted for Mamdani at some point a lot of them are only like 26 years old or whatever, but that at some point in the past there was some issue that they didn't care about that they should have cared about more, and that this is somehow performative?
No, the issue for me isn't like, performativity. The point is just
it's
that,
not.
No,
I thought you were just talking about how they were posturing as having always cared about something when that wasn't true. It was
no. I'm saying their narratives. Yeah, their narratives are this way. But what's interesting to me, again, what I'm trying to explain in the book, and is why it is that concern for these social issues tends to wax and wane the way it does. Why do we have these really intense moments of concern about anti-racism, feminism, gay rights, environmentalism that just evaporate later? And this actually does matter, because one of the things that you see over and over is that attention becomes really intense, and then it just evaporates once people are in a more comfortable position, even though the lives of the problem isn't solved, the challenges these other people are facing aren't dealt with. But the elites, after they're no longer affected by this issue, they just go on and do other things. And that's the problem.
You use Black Lives Matter. Sorry, you use Occupy Wall Street as an example of this, right?
I used Occupy in chapter 2. Oh, well, one of the things I do note is that, yeah, the composition of Occupy was just very different. It wasn't as broad a based a movement as people assume. In fact, the people who took part in Occupy were basically the same people who were really into Black Lives Matter, were really into Me Too, were really, it's this kind of the same block of people.
Which, tracks. I cared about Occupy Wall Street. I care about Me Too. I care about Black Lives Matter. So what does that mean?
For the point for actually the one thing that was important about Occupy, that's very different. Actually, Occupy provides a nice juxtaposition with Zoran Mamdani. So the Occupy movement was basically aggressively non-political or anti-political. They refused to take statements on things. They refused to identify candidates. They refused to do all sorts, and the kind of governance structure rather than the kind of inclusive, broad-based, broad appeal kind of rhetoric and approach that Zoran Mamdani is taking. The Occupy movement
Ms.
was
Pop,
governed by
didn't
this.
didn't the 99% versus 1% language that we all use now come out of Occupy? Isn't that the most sort of broad-based, inclusive framing that is possible?
I think it is not actually very helpful. So it came out of Occupy, but one of the things I stress in the book is that it's actually not a good way of understanding a lot of social phenomena, actually.
But is it a good way of mobilizing the 99% to support programs like Medicare for All, universal pre-K, $15 minimum wage, et cetera?
Actually, that's also not clear. One thing that is clear in the polling and in a lot of the political research, it can be effective. One thing that you see actually a lot is that ordinary people don't care that much about inequality under most circumstances. They actually don't care about it that much. It's very particular types of circumstances where people come to be cued in more on inequality and where messages tied to inequality become more salient and resonant with voters. But even there, the way those messages are structured actually does matter a lot.
And what are the circumstances when people care about inequality? Is it when they're struggling to survive?
When their own, yeah, in a few ways. In times of economic,
okay.
In times of economic downturn or stagnation.
Obviously.
But even
then, that's just another way of saying people become politically engaged when their lives depend on it. That's just another way of saying people plug in.
Well, my point is that the 99% to 1% is that class-based narrative, that kind of railing against rich people.
The 1%, not just rich people, not people who make $300,000 a year.
But actually, this is where I was going to go with it, is that actually one of the things that you can see in some of the polling is that, and the academic research on this, is that the kind of messaging that's often appealing kind of is to focus less on the fact that rich people are rich and the rich suck, but more to focus on things like how about kind of unfair processes. Like it's not right that a rich person and a regular person can go to court and have very different kind of experiences of the justice system. Like, so what people are concerned about is unfairness. What people are concerned about is corruption.
And Occupy
nepotism.
came out of the housing crisis. Occupy was born out of the housing crisis and the bailout that bailed out the institutions that caused the crisis and immiserated wealth for like all of American homeowners and cut their collective wealth by 40 to 50%. While the perpetrators got off scot-free and got sinecures in the Obama administration.
And Occupy would have been a lot more effective, actually, if they had taken an actual, like, again, they literally, actively, explicitly declined to produce policy platforms or candidates. The kind of success that Zoran Mamdani is having and that the left is having today is by explicitly rejecting that approach altogether. Zoran Mamdani had a very specific set of policy proposals he campaigned on, and not only did he run for an office, but then he advanced other people, specific candidates.
I agree. Zoran is great,
but concrete political agenda.
Zoran is great, but you brought up Occupy Wall Street. We were talking about Occupy and the Vietnam War as this question of why it is that people start to care about various things. And the argument is basically they start to care when they become self-interested because there was a huge economic crisis that imperiled an entire generation and their parents. So people like me who were just graduating in 2007 and their parents who are homeowners, somebody's parents, who was not mine, who were homeowners. We lived in an apartment in New York. And who were suffering and who saw real life implications of what happens when the elites play with financial institution like it's gambling. So that seems to me to be a good, but wait a minute. You can have a conversation about why Occupy failed. People have a lot of conversations about whether it was co-opted and infiltrated by the American state. All kinds of things may or may not have happened in those instances. But if the question is it appropriate or useful to condemn the sort of class, here's the question. Is the class status of the people in that group the reason why it failed? And was it bad that people of that class chose to engage on that issue at that time in that way?
Okay, so I'll do the second one first. Was it bad that they chose to engage on these issues? No. Was the class status of the people who were part of it the reason it failed? Partially, yes. And the reason why is because the movement adopted modes of political organizing and discourse that were really alienating to other people. So imagine you were a dock worker and you went down to Zuccotti Park. You're just a white dock worker, and you heard some of this rhetoric about how the rich are benefiting and getting off, and people like you are falling behind, and you're not. Like, say you heard some of this kind of rhetoric, you went down to Zuccotti Park and you wanted to talk, and then someone said, hey, buddy. Here, we're governed by the progressive stack. I noticed that you're a white man, and so you'll have to wait your turn. And then everyone is snapping at them in response. You would leave that place and hate everyone there, and maybe even hate the cause. But you would certainly hate everyone there. You would disengage from that movement.
Was Zoran successful because he was successfully able, it's the same class of people involved in the Zoran campaign, right? So is the issue the class of the PMC are involved, or was it the choice of the sort of the specific culture that was emergent at that time and was emergent at Zuccotti Park versus now? This is what I'm getting at is like this identity category is limiting. And I think it's mostly useful to people who want to use it as a cudgel to ignore whatever somebody says if they happen not to be personally earning less than $50,000 a year.
Well, but it's not a cut. So one of the things I show, and I have an essay called The Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives, where I analyze the 2024 election. What you can see is that there's systematic movement among, where basically symbolic capitalists have been increasingly consolidated within the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party's platform and messaging changed in ways that better reflect the ways that people like us tend to talk and think about society. And as the Democratic Party shifted in that direction,
people like us, but okay, people like somebody, but not people like
symbolic capitalists. And they talked much more like symbolic capitalists, like what you would see at Harvard and the New York Times and the Atlantic than they did before. And as a consequence of that, as those shifts were happening, working class people, Black people, less affluent people, less rural people, religious people of all stripes started migrating away from the Democratic Party in every midterm and general election.
We established that.
And so again, and so it matters. Like the real problem for the Democrats for a long time has been overindulging the kinds of ways that many symbolic capitalists want people to talk and think about politics. So Zoran Mamdani adopted he aggressively, basically, refused to engage in the kind of politics that has dominated the symbolic professions for the last 10 years, and that's why he won.
Yeah, it's a cart horse situation with us. I'm not going to the Democratic Party. We didn't a bunch of the directionality is backwards. Is my opinion. The Democratic Party isn't like, oh no, Ta-Nehisi Coates made me use woke language. The Democratic Party and the people that it serves chose Ta-Nehisi. I don't want to put him in the crosshairs because he's been doing such good work, but Nicole Hannah-Jones, we chose to put her there because she uses language to derail movements that we don't like, which is why I personally, I was like fresh out of law school, not paying that much attention. I gotta confess, and just trying to like pass the bar in 2011. So I wasn't as focused on Occupy Wall Street, but I am frustrated by what I think is a sort of revisionist history. No one wants to be woke. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. Everybody wants to say, we're the smart kids that figured out how to do it the right way now, without there being enough acknowledgement of the ways that movements were intentionally derailed and certain narratives were promulgated to turn people against movements. And I wasn't there for Occupy, really, but I was there for Black Lives Matter. And there's a very similar narrative around Black Lives Matter that you talk about in your book. Sorry, I'm pointing like the book is in front of me, but it's just my phone. You argue that, or you seem to suggest, and I'll give you an opportunity to characterize it in your own words, but you seem to suggest that there was a sort of performativity around Black Lives Matter that people put to the side and got over because it wasn't sincere. And while I certainly think that there is some element of that, my diagnosis of why Black Lives Matter was basically erased by the end of 2020 was because Joe Biden wrapped up the primary around the same time that George Floyd was killed. And suddenly it became important to shift into beating Trump mode, which means moderating. And he got on TV every day and said that we have to fund the police harder. And if not, we're going to lose to Donald Trump. And everybody put their signs away and said, okay, now we got to shift into police are good or else we're going to lose the election to Donald Trump. And that what we see is a recurring pattern of Democrats, frankly, being the movement killers. Again, Occupy Wall Street doesn't look so cute when Obama's in office. Who are they riling against? This cool black guy? No, that's a bad idea. You mentioned Clinton's before as a moderating era. Again, we finally got our liberal in office after decades of a decade of Republican rule. He comes in announcing his campaign at the capital punishment execution of a black mentally challenged prisoner to show that he's tough on crime, does assist a soldier, plays the saxophone, and is in fact a right-moving, moderate impulse that kills whatever revolutionary spirit, World Trade Organization type revolutionary fervor that was going on at the time.
Well, actually, so Clinton is a good example of. So a lot of the things that Clinton did, you're absolutely right. He killed a lot of movements, but he also made a lot of policy decisions that really favored symbolic capitalists at the expense of working people. So everything from
NAFTA, welfare reform.
The welfare reform pushed a lot of people into accepting low-wage work that benefits us who consume these services a lot more than the rest of America in a way that, yeah. And so you can, but you know, even the Biden 2020 campaign was kind of wild because, like, if you did a drinking game for every time Joe Biden said systemic racism in the 2020 campaign, I'm a Muslim, I don't drink, but you would be wasting, like, good luck to your liver.
Yeah,
right?
But that's my point, Musa. That's my point. They are intentionally doing economic conservatism. And by the way, increasing policing is economic conservatism because the purpose of police is to protect property interests. That's what they're there to do. They shoot dogs, they shoot babies, and they protect property. So and at the same time as saying we're going to do we're going to give you some woke language, but I'm sure as hell not going to do anything that would prevent George Floyd from getting killed.
Well, I'll say one thing that was a little distressing to me, though, because like you can see a lot of Democratic politicians feel pressure from their constituents. So there is an element of it from like donors and what don't. In fact, one of the things I show in my book is like the billionaire donor class is actually aggressively more woke than almost they're the ones pushing but they also feel pressure from a lot of their highly educated constituents, and you could even see this in the Bernie Sanders campaign. So if you looked at how Bernie Sanders talked about issues like race and immigration in 2016 compared to 2020, to his detriment, in my opinion, in 2020,
again.
He did.
Okay.
He did. You disagree that he shifted on this, or that
he was literally killed. Not literally.
No, I know.
His campaign was killed in 2016 over this shit.
This is what I mean.
Slightly, ever so slightly. By the way, I'm not frustrated with you. I'm frustrated because this is like the 100th time somebody has come on the podcast and argued Bernie lost in 2020 because he went too woke. And
no. That's not my argument. That's not my argument. My argument is
let me
just
not get ahead of myself. Though.
That even Bernie Sanders, someone who I really respect, and someone who has been broadly resistant to this kind of stuff, that even Bernie Sanders did feel some pressure. And the pressure wasn't from the billionaires on Bernie. It was from constituents in the Democratic base.
It wasn't constituents. No, I disagree with that part. It was the media. It was the PMCs in the media who were hired for the purpose of doing their job, which was to set upon Bernie Sanders and convince the Atlantic reading public, to convince this person that I always keep in my front of my mind as like my prototypical boomer, highly educated, liberal Atlantic reading person. Do you know how Chuck Schumer has this like fictional family that he pretended was real? Like I have my version of that liberal in my head, who's a person I really know that I don't say who it is, but I very much am thinking of a specific person. You know, that person needed to be convinced that Bernie Sanders was a racist and that it justified their voting for Elizabeth Warren. And the attack dogs at the Atlantic were set upon Bernie to do exactly that. And so Bernie had to capitulate to them, not to any real person in the public. It was to like Joyanne Reid.
The problem with the Democratic primaries, though, in a lot of cases is that if you look at who turns out for Democratic primaries compared to the broader electorate of people who vote for Democrats, it is skewed towards the kind of people who read those Atlantic columns and stuff.
100%.
So they're also the primary vote. So in virtue of pleasing the Atlantic, you also please the kind of voters who would
100%. 100%. I completely agree with you. But this is why it's important. This is why it's not like PMCs in the abstract. It's elites, the actual 1% and smaller than that, who are exploiting these networks of cultural capital. Media being chief among them, understanding that these are the kind of elite sinecures. What did you call them? You had a really good term for it, like
social justice sinecures.
Yeah, no, but these like fake jobs that were created. I guess maybe it was just social justice.
There was bullshit jobs also.
Okay, yeah, sure, bullshit jobs. But that the media was a repository for all these people who needed bullshit jobs, who had all this higher education, didn't know where to do it. Lots of cultural capital in being a writer, lots of cultural capital in being a journalist. A historically important function, though, diminishing because of the corporate ownership of the media. Okay. And that you could pick and choose a glutted hiring market of the kinds of voices that would advance your economic agenda unwittingly by prioritizing and centering a cultural agenda as more important than the kinds of things that Bernie Sanders were saying. And knowing that you have an outsized influence, Batya Ungar-Sargon, God bless her, don't agree with the things she said, but I do remember a part of her first book about the media, where she does run through an interesting history of the media, and she points out that it used to be that you bought a paper for a penny, and it was everybody had a penny and people could read in the new world. And so there was this no media infrastructure of newspapers that springs up. But at a certain point when the advertising model takes hold, certainly doesn't matter as much how many copies you sell for the penny. It's whether or not advertisers who sell expensive things get their paper in front of an expensive audience. So you get a different kinds of readership and it's not populist anymore. Okay, excellent point, Batya. I'll give you credit for writing about that in your book, No Bad News. Don't buy her book. Just trust that I summarized it well. Okay. That being said, now the media is functioning in exactly this way, where the priority is the people who own it don't even care about advertisers that much anymore because they're billionaires. They don't even really need the money. What they care about is using it as a tool to advance their political and economic interests. And they do that by hiring Nicole Hannah-Jones and Joyanne Reid and all these people. And so it's top down, top down, top down.
But it's not just top down, in part because so even Nicole Hannah-Jones and et al. You can publish an essay by someone, but unless it actually goes viral, that is, unless the readership really responds to it pretty well, what they'll do is they'll just cycle through other people. So one or try other narratives or whatever. But like, so part of the reason for Nicole Hannah-Jones's success, sure, is that billionaires and so on are the people who hired her like what she was doing. But like another part of the reason for her success is that the readership of the New York Times and so on liked what she was doing. And there is this kind of growing parody of the kind of people who write for the New York Times and the kind of people who read the New York Times. It's increasingly the same narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society.
What do you do with these Zoran PMCs? The difference between those people and the Zoran PMCs is that largely because of their age, they're not consuming the same media. And they have a very different perception of what the ills of the world are, what's causing their problems, what's the status of Israel, Gaza, right? And so they're making different kinds of choices, not because they're not PMC, they are PMC, but they're PMC with different consumption habits and a different understanding of the world consequently.
Well, again, if you polled um, working class or poor New Yorkers about their top concerns, and in fact, there are polls on this, and you can see this actually in a lot of elections. When you look at what people's top concerns are, you do see a significant difference often between symbolic capitalists and kind of and large and basically anyone who's not. You see a significant in priority now. And so, like the centering of free childcare for all as one of the top priorities of the Mamdani administration, that is reflective of that's not incidental to the composition of some of the base that animates him, right? So you can see the fingerprints of now. Again, that's not to say working on expanding childcare access is bad or that it won't benefit working people, but it's also not the top priority actually of a lot of working people just because they consume it less.
And what's the top priority according to this poll of working class New Yorkers or poor New Yorkers?
Well, so if you so depending on I can pull it up. I don't want to give misinformation, but some things that people are concerned about broadly are often the cost of things like groceries.
That was a priority for Zoran. 5 free grocery stores.
Of course, yeah. Is the cost of things like groceries, the cost of things like there's a lot of concern among New Yorkers about public safety and public order again, and sometimes often in a way that's out of step with actual crime trends. But the point is like even if crime trends haven't increased, if you just live in a neighborhood where you just don't enjoy a lot of physical security, then that's a problem for you. Even if crime hasn't gotten worse, even if it's the same as it was 10 years ago, 5 years, even if it's better than it was 10 years ago, which actually in many cases, if you look at recent crime trends, you're actually seeing decreases, sometimes historic decreases. But even if crime is going down, at the macro level, if you personally are not secure, or if a whole bunch of other people and your social network might have experienced adverse effects of crime, then that's going to be something that's very salient to you, even if the macro trends are going in a favorable direction. And so this is another thing that you see a lot with less affluent voters, is concerns about public safety and public order rank pretty high. Yeah, I don't want to give you misinformation.
Okay. So what I would take away from that is that Mamdani actually did have an agenda that aligns with what the top priorities of New Yorkers are. He famously went viral for the first time and sort of got his name on the map by doing man on the street interviews with Trump voters in New York and asking them what their priorities were and why they had maybe left the Democratic Party, et cetera. And that he very much has, yeah.
No, I think Mamdani himself as a candidate is great about it. Like he did interviews with food truck people talking about, well, why is I think that's
falafel inflation or whatever, halal card inflation or whatever you call it.
It was beautiful. It was great.
So I don't know. I'm obviously not being sufficiently clear. So I'm going to say this and then I'm going to release us all. I'm going to release us all from my tedium. The movement that he's been put together, and that one last night, is getting impugned today, as we speak, for somehow being inauthentic because it is not sufficiently working class. I am wary of this particular kind of attack and of characterizations of the PMC as existentially a problem because of the gap in class interest and this bifurcation, this separation that you do throughout the book between the 20% and the 80%. Phenomenologically, I understand that there are obviously advantages, enormous advantages that are accrued to the 20% that the 80% don't have. I understand that it feels really annoying and gross when anybody makes one of those arguments about how it's impossible to live in New York with a salary of less than $500,000. Like I get all of that. Okay. But I also see how the how elites want to weaponize ire against sort of yuppies, basically middle class people who are highly educated, to advance their non-agenda. They pretend to care for the middle class, but do this carve out of, well, if you're a middle class person and you went to school, or you're a middle class person and you have blue hair, or you're a middle class person and you live in New York, or you're a middle class person who likes to eat arugula or avocado toast, then somehow you're bad. And I am extremely hesitant to lean into that, even though I really appreciate your analysis, the analysis of Catherine Liu, et cetera, about the ways that certain members of the PMC, because they don't feel like they've got the benefit of the social bargain of their degrees, et cetera, are able to be recruited into the project in the media and elsewhere to run cover for billionaires by advancing an agenda that prioritizes cultural victories over economic ones.
Yeah, I mean, here I think I think we're not actually very far apart here. So one of the things that I stress a lot as well is, like, on the right, there's basically a non-agenda that anti-woke and conservative people are basically in this kind of implicit and sometimes direct coalition to undermine a lot of social goals. I don't think that symbolic capitalists are bad. I don't think that we'd never do any good. And I also don't think it's the case that our interests and working people's interests are diametrically opposed. The thing I'm trying to raise the salience of, though, is that there are some moments, and there are a number of instances, where there is significant daylight or even diametrical opposition between what's in our interests and what's in the interests of other people. And we're often not that attuned to it. Sometimes we advocate for things in the name of other people that are diametrically opposed to what they want and that cut against their own express interests. That to me is the problem. The convergent, when there's convergent, when there's moments of convergent interest, and people are advocating for things that might benefit them disproportionately, but also benefit other people, I have no problem with that.
And I'm inclined to focus on the convergence and try to build a movement around the convergence, which means 99% is good, actually. And I do wonder what you think of the ways that I've seen, like I clicked through some of your other interviews. There are a not insignificant number of more conservative leaning people who really cottoned on to your argument because they are very happy. And people may say this to me too, right? So I'm not like, people like, Brianna, you're empowering right-wing arguments by making fun of identity politics or whatever. I get it. But like, I try to be very careful about how I make these arguments. And I know that you did too. You did a really good job laying the foundation for what woke is and what isn't, what it is and isn't, and how you don't want to use it as a pejorative in your book in the first chapter. And I really did appreciate, or in the intro, and I really did appreciate that. But then I also was clicking through some of these interviews where it seemed like some of the interviewers were more conservative, libertarian, and champing at the bit to make this just a beat up on liberal elites.
Well, but one thing that you'll notice if you listen to some of those interviews, and actually if you read some of the reviews from right-leaning, in fact, on my Substack, I have a roundup of the reviews where I note that the reception has actually been much better of the book on the left and the right. Like, it was named one of the top books of the year by Mother Jones, but a lot of conservative writers actually hated, especially the fact that I spend no small amount of effort in the book trying to stress that a lot of the anti-woke people are basically the same as the people that they criticize. They live in the same kinds of communities. They have the same kinds of lifestyles. They work in the same kind of things. So anything that I say about is symmetrical just because they believe different things in their hearts. If they behave the same way and live in the same communities and enjoy the same kind of lifestyles, that, you know, and then likewise, they even approach politics in a very similar way. And so I've stressed that in the book. I stressed that in the interviews. I stressed that on my Substack in essays like The Cultural Contradictions of the Anti-Woke, or Bringing Culture into the Culture Wars. And the right has noticed that, and they have not loved it. And so I think it's important for me to keep hitting that note, both because it's true, and to avoid producing a culture war artifact. If that's, that wasn't the intent or goal of the book. I try to produce a symmetrical analysis. Oh, and the last thing I'll say, that might be So when I initially wrote the book, my plan was I was going to spend half the book looking at symbolic capitalists and our communities and our institutions and our legitimizing narratives. Towards the back half of the book, I was going to turn the analytic lens the other way and look at the constellation of elites and regular people that are increasingly defining themselves against us. And the anti-woke people, the kind of right-leaning people, and so on. I wrote the book that way, as I initially envisioned, with the symmetrical analysis. But it was just too long. And so I tried to push it through. I was like, oh, but look, Richard Florida's Rise of the Creative Class. It's like, poof. And they were like, that's all well and good, buddy, but you're not Richard Florida. You're a grad student. And so I couldn't make that happen. And so what we ended up doing is splitting the initial manuscript into 2 books. So my second book, Those People, will be the back half of the book, the content that was cut from this first book, where I'll be turning the analytic lens the other way. So for people who are interested in or who want more, who felt like that was maybe missing and wanted more of that, all I'll say is, like, stay tuned for my next book. Initially, I had a much more symmetrical analysis, but this was out of my hands.
Publishers, what are you going to do? Those elite class bastards never let us win. Musa al-Gharbi, thank you for being so generous with your time. We'll have to have you back to talk about your next book, and I promise to keep it to a tight 90 minutes. Where can people find your current book, We Were Never Woke, and any of your other work on the internet and beyond?
Yeah, so if you go to my website, musaalgharbi.com, you can connect to my public-facing writing and my social media and so on. And then I have a Substack called Symbolic Capitalism, where I extend the analysis of the first book and into the second one, look at the threads that tie between them.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for tuning into this episode of Bad Faith Podcast. Look at all this extra content. Wow, 3 hours. Brianna, you give us so much. I'm so grateful. Interesting that you say that. If you're feeling that way, maybe you mosey on over to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and subscribe so you can get an extra episode of Bad Faith every month over there on Patreon. Also, don't forget to go to YouTube, like and subscribe, and hit the bell. We are being aggressively suppressed over on YouTube. Many of you have been noticing it over in the YouTube comments. So make sure not just to subscribe, but to hit the notification bell. Go ahead and check in on Mondays and Thursdays and try to catch the videos as they air live. Write in the comment section, try to boost it that way, and post on social media. That's always appreciated. As always, take care of yourselves and remember to keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.